Tonight, we travel back in time to uncover the story of one of nature's most merciless seasons, a winter that tested the limits of human endurance and forever changed the American frontier. Before we begin, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world where winter wasn't just inconvenient but potentially lethal, where the difference between warmth and cold meant the difference between life and death, where entire communities could be isolated for months, where children froze to death on their way home from school, and where the bodies of hundreds of thousands of cattle stretched across the plains as far as the eye could see. This is the story of the winter of 1886 to 1887, and the devastating blizzards that followed in 1888. It's a story of human courage and hubris, of nature's overwhelming power, and of how a single season reshaped an entire region and changed American history forever. To understand the magnitude of what happened during this terrible winter, we need to first understand the world it destroyed. The 1880s represented a unique moment in American history, a brief window when the frontier seemed to offer unlimited opportunity to those brave or foolhardy enough to claim it. The Great Plains stretched endlessly beneath vast skies, a sea of grass that rippled in summer winds and bent beneath winter snows. To settlers arriving from the east, from Europe, from everywhere, these plains represented freedom, possibility, and the chance to build something entirely new. The government was practically giving land away through the Homestead Act. All you needed was the courage to claim 160 acres and the determination to prove up on it for 5 years. Towns sprang up seemingly overnight along the expanding railroad lines. Hastily built structures of raw lumber and sod became homes, businesses, schools, and churches. The sound of hammers and saws echoed across the prairie as settlers constructed the physical infrastructure of their dreams. These were people who believed in progress, in manifest destiny, in the idea that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle nature might devise. The railroad companies advertised aggressively, painting pictures of a land of milk and honey where crops grew tall and livestock flourished with minimal effort. Promotional materials showed verdant farmlands and prosperous ranches, conveniently omitting the harsh realities of prairie life, the droughts that could wither crops in a matter of weeks, the tornadoes that could demolish entire towns in minutes, the grasshopper plagues that could devour every green thing for miles, and most dangerous of all, the winters that could kill with frightening efficiency. But in the early and mid-1880s it seemed like the optimists might be right. A series of relatively mild winters had convinced many that the climate was actually improving, that settlement itself was somehow moderating the weather. There was even a popular theory that rain followed the plough, that the act of farming actually increased precipitation. It was a comforting delusion that would prove catastrophically expensive. The cattle industry had exploded across the Great Plains, driven by Eastern and European investment and the seemingly limitless expanse of free grazing land. This was the era of the open range, when vast herds roamed unfenced grasslands, fattening on native grasses before being driven to railheads for shipment to eastern markets. Between 1866 and 1885, approximately 5.7 million cattle were driven north from Texas to market or to stock the northern ranges. The business model seemed foolproof. Buy cheap land or simply use the open range for free. Let cattle graze on natural grasses year-round. Round them up annually and drive them to market. Watch profits accumulate with minimal labour or infrastructure costs. Investment returns of 30 to 40% annually were promised and sometimes delivered. Money poured into the cattle industry from Boston, New York, London, and Edinburgh. Wealthy investors who had never seen the plains or spent a winter in Montana bought into massive ranching operations sight unseen, trusting the rosy projections of promoters who had every incentive to paint the rosiest possible picture. Some operations claimed herds of 80,000 head or more. The Poudre Livestock Company in Colorado had tens of thousands of cattle scattered across unfenced ranges. The Swan Land and Cattle Company in Wyoming ran over 100,000 head. Theodore Roosevelt, who would later become president, had invested substantially in ranching operations in Dakota Territory. These operations were managed by men who often had more confidence than experience. Many of the investors and even some of the ranch managers had no real understanding of the cyclical nature of plains weather, of how quickly conditions could change, of how brutal a hard winter could be. They had been seduced by a string of mild winters into believing that such conditions were the new normal. Traditional ranching wisdom held that you needed to store winter feed for your cattle, that you couldn't depend entirely on the animals finding forage under snow. But storing hay required labor, land, and investment that cut into those attractive profit margins. Many of the large operations decided it was unnecessary. After all, the cattle had survived previous winters just fine by pouring through the snow to reach grass beneath. Why waste money on hay you probably wouldn't need? The indigenous peoples who had lived off the plains for generations could have told them differently. The Lakota, Cheyenne, Crow, and other tribes had learned through centuries of experience to read the signs that nature provided. They observed animal behavior, studied plant growth patterns, and paid attention to subtle indicators that predicted the severity of coming winters. When squirrels gathered nuts with unusual urgency, when beavers built unusually large dams, when birds migrated earlier than normal, these were warnings from the natural world that hard times were coming. Some settlers learned to read these signs. Those who had befriended indigenous people or who had spent enough years on the frontier to develop their own weather sense noticed troubling indicators in 1886. Cattle were growing exceptionally thick winter coats. Horses developed woolly coverings that made them look almost prehistoric. Even the chickens grew additional down beneath their regular feathers. Animals knew what was coming even if humans refused to see it. But for every settler who heeded these warnings and prepared accordingly, there were dozens who dismissed them as superstition or old wives' tales. The modern age was dawning. Science and progress were the new gods. Surely human ingenuity and determination could master nature's moods. This hubris would exact a terrible price. Frontier towns in the 1880s were rough, functional places where survival took precedence over comfort or elegance. Buildings were thrown up quickly using whatever materials were available. In treeless regions, settlers cut blocks of sod to construct their homes. These sod houses or soddies were actually quite effective as shelter, providing good insulation against both summer heat and winter cold. But they were also dark, damp, and prone to leaking when it rained. Snakes and insects sometimes fell from the dirt ceiling. In areas with more timber, settlers built log cabins or frame houses. These structures range from fairly substantial to barely adequate. Many of the houses constructed during the settlement boom of the 1880s were built as quickly and cheaply as possible, just sturdy enough to meet the requirements for proving up on a homestead claim. They had thin walls, inadequate insulation, and drafty construction that made them difficult to heat in extreme cold. Schools were often among the first community buildings erected in frontier settlements. These one-room schoolhouses served students ranging from first graders to teenagers, all taught by a single teacher, who might be barely older than some of the students. The buildings were simple frame structures, heated by a single wood or coal stove that struggled to maintain adequate temperature during cold weather. Windows were small to conserve heat, making the interiors dim even on sunny days. Most frontier schools closed during the worst winter weather, but they remained open during mild periods even in January and February. Parents sent children to school whenever conditions allowed, because education was seen as crucial for future success. Children often walked considerable distances to reach school, sometimes several miles across open prairie. In good weather, this was merely tiring. In bad weather, it could be deadly. The social fabric of frontier communities was woven from threads of mutual dependence and cooperation. Neighbours might be miles apart geographically, but they were bound together by the recognition that survival often depended on helping each other. Barn raisings, quilting bees, church socials, and community dances provided opportunities for socializing, while also accomplishing necessary work or building social bonds. News travelled slowly on the frontier. In the 1880s, the United States Weather Service was still in its infancy. The service had been transferred from the Army Signal Corps to civilian control only in 1891. In 1886, weather forecasting was primitive at best. Observations were taken at scattered locations and transmitted by telegraph when lines were functioning. Forecasts were often vague and sometimes wildly inaccurate. There was no radio, no television, no internet, no smartphones with weather apps. For most frontier residents, weather prediction meant looking at the sky, feeling the wind, and observing animal behavior. Some people had a knack for it, an intuitive sense based on experience and observation. Others never developed this skill and remained perpetually surprised by what the weather brought. This gap between those who could read nature's signs and those who couldn't would prove critical during the coming disasters. The summer of 1886 was brutal across the Great Plains. A high-pressure system became parked over the region, producing weeks of relentless heat and virtually no precipitation. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees day after day. The sun beat down from a cloudless sky, baking the earth and withering vegetation. Streams that normally ran year-round dried to muddy trickles or disappeared entirely. Water holes that cattle depended on became dust bowls. The drought's timing could not have been worse. This was the critical growing season when grasses should have been putting on their summer growth, building the reserves that would sustain them through winter dormancy. Instead, the grasses turned brown and brittle early, their growth stunted by lack of moisture. Some areas that would normally produce lush, knee-high grasses managed only sparse, ankle-high coverage. In the most severely affected regions, the ground was virtually bare, stripped clean by overgrazing cattle desperately seeking any available forage. And there were far too many cattle competing for what little grass remained. Years of optimistic investment had led to severe overstocking of the ranges. Where the land might sustainably support 50,000 head, ranchers were running 80,000 or more. Every bit of available forage was being consumed, often before it had a chance to produce seeds for the next generation of plants. The range was being eaten out from under the cattle that depended on it. In some areas, desperate ranchers resorted to cutting down trees so cattle could eat the leaves and bark. Others drove their herds hundreds of miles in search of better grazing, but found that everywhere they went, other ranchers had already had the same idea. The northern ranges that usually offered good summer pasture were already overcrowded with local cattle, plus thousands more driven up from drought-stricken regions to the south. Lightning storms that summer brought little rain but plenty of fire. Dry grass ignited easily and burned ferociously, driven by hot winds across thousands of acres before exhausting itself or reaching a natural firebreak. In November 1885, massive wildfires had swept from Kansas through the Oklahoma Panhandle and into the Texas Panhandle, consuming whatever grass had survived the previous summer's drought. Now, in the fall of 1886, new fires broke out, further reducing the already inadequate forage available for the coming winter. Some ranchers began to worry. Those with experience on the plains understood that cattle going into winter in poor condition, combined with inadequate forage under snow, was a recipe for disaster. They began making what preparations they could. Hay was cut and stacked near ranch headquarters. Some cattle were sold off early, even at depressed prices, to reduce the number of animals that would need to be carried through the winter. A few ranchers even began experimenting with fencing, creating enclosed pastures where cattle could be kept closer to hay supplies. But these were the minority. Most large operations, particularly those owned by absentee investors, continued as they had always done. The owners were thousands of miles away in comfortable Eastern or European cities. The managers they employed were often more concerned with keeping costs down and profits up than with long-term sustainability. When a few voices warned that disaster was approaching, they were dismissed as overly cautious or trying to cover up mismanagement. The cattle themselves showed increasing signs of stress as summer turned to autumn. Their ribs became visible beneath hides that should have been sleek with good flesh. Their movements became listless, conserving energy that should have been abundant. Cows that should have been nursing healthy calves stood with flanks drawn in, barely able to sustain themselves, much less a calf. Many calves died during weaning, too weak to survive the transition from milk to grass. As autumn progressed, cattle that should have been putting on weight for winter were instead barely maintaining or even losing condition. They faced the approaching cold season already weakened, already stressed, their bodies lacking the fat reserves that could have helped them survive hard weather. It was the worst possible preparation for what was about to come. Other signs continued to accumulate for those paying attention. Migrating birds left earlier than usual, as if eager to escape what was approaching. Squirrels and other rodents gathered food with frantic intensity, building stores far larger than normal. Domestic animals like horses and dogs grew unusually heavy coats, their bodies instinctively preparing for extreme cold. Even insects seemed to burrow deeper than usual into the earth. Some Native Americans who still lived in the region tried to warn their white neighbors. They had seen these signs before and knew what they meant. Hard winter coming. Very hard winter. But most settlers paid little attention. What did the Indians know about modern ranching and farming? This was the progressive age of science and industry. Old superstitions had no place in this new era. This dismissal of indigenous knowledge would prove to be a fatal mistake for many. By October, some prudent settlers were making serious preparations. Wood was cut and stacked. Extra supplies of flour, beans, salt pork, and other staples were laid in. Families who lived in isolated homesteads made certain they had enough of everything to last through an extended period of being completely cut off from the outside world. They checked and rechecked their shelters, looking for any gap that might let in deadly cold, any weakness that might fail under the weight of heavy snow. But preparation had its limits. Frontier families were rarely wealthy. They had limited resources and limited capacity to stockpile supplies. The general stores in frontier towns had limited inventory. If everyone had tried to purchase extensive emergency supplies, the stores would have been emptied within days. Most people had to trust that the winter would be survivable, that they had done enough, that they had prepared adequately. For some, that trust would prove to be well-founded. For others, it would prove tragically misplaced. Winter announced its arrival early in November 1886. The first snow came before Thanksgiving, falling steadily for days and accumulating to depths that surprised even long-time frontier residents. This wasn't the light dusting that might melt in a few days. This was heavy, wet snow that piled up foot after foot, bending trees and collapsing poorly built structures under its weight. The November blizzards came in waves. A storm would blow through, dumping snow and driving it into deep drifts. Then a brief clearing would allow people to dig out and assess the damage. Then another storm would arrive, adding more snow on top of what hadn't yet melted. By the end of November, some areas had accumulated several feet of snow, far more than normal for that early in the season. Temperatures plunged along with the snow. Readings of 20 and 30 below zero were recorded at various locations. The cold was made worse by strong winds that created wind chill factors well below the actual air temperature. Exposed skin could freeze in minutes. Breathing the frigid air hurt the lungs. Simply being outside for any length of time became genuinely dangerous. Cattle began dying almost immediately. The animals were already weakened from the summer's drought and poor forage. Now they faced deep snow and bitter cold, while still trying to survive on whatever grass they could paw through the snow to reach. Cows would dig down through a foot or more of snow, exhausting themselves in the process, only to find brown, withered grass of minimal nutritional value. The energy expended in finding food was often greater than the energy gained from eating it. In many areas, snow fell, then partially melted during a brief warm spell, then froze solid as temperatures dropped again. This created a hard crust of ice over the snow that cattle couldn't break through. The grass below might as well have been encased in concrete for all the good it did them. Hungry cattle tried desperately to break through, bloodying their hooves and muzzles on the sharp ice, accomplishing nothing. Cowboys working for the large ranches tried to help where they could. They drove cattle to areas where wind had blown snow off the grass. They broke through ice on ponds and creeks so animals could drink. In some cases, they led cattle to haystacks that far-sighted ranchers had prepared. But there were hundreds of thousands of cattle scattered across millions of acres. A few dozen cowboys could only help a tiny fraction of the animals that needed assistance. The sheer scale of the cattle industry's expansion now became a catastrophic liability. If there had been 10,000 cattle in a region, it might have been possible to provide significant help. But there were hundreds of thousands of cattle, far too many for any human intervention to make much difference. Nature would sort things out in nature's way, and that way was brutally efficient. Smaller homesteading operations with just a few head of cattle or a small herd of sheep faced different challenges. These families often had their animals closer to home, sometimes in rough barns or shelters. They had stored some hay and could provide supplemental feeding. While they certainly faced hardship and might lose some animals, they generally had a fighting chance to bring most of their livestock through the winter. The massive open-range operations had no such advantage. Their cattle were scattered to the horizon. Most had no shelters beyond natural features like hills or coulees that provided limited protection from wind. The hay that a few operations had stored was woefully inadequate for the number of animals and the severity of the conditions. These operations could do little but watch as their investments literally froze to death on the range. As November turned to December, there was hope that the worst might be over. Perhaps this early severe weather would be followed by a more moderate midwinter. Perhaps the weather patterns would shift. Perhaps a Chinook wind would blow warm air from the Pacific and provide temporary relief. People clung to these hopes because the alternative, accepting that this was only the beginning of something far worse, was too terrible to contemplate. Human casualties began to mount during November as well, though the full toll wouldn't be known until spring. Cowboys caught out in storms while checking cattle sometimes failed to make it back to ranch headquarters. Homesteaders travelling between settlements got lost in whiteout conditions and froze to death within sight of safety. The distance between being okay and being dead could be measured in yards and minutes. One particularly poignant account from Montana described a cowboy found frozen in his saddle in the spring, his horse standing beside him, still alive and grazing. The cowboy had apparently been exhausted and cold, dozed off while riding back to the ranch, and simply never woke up. His horse had continued walking until it found grass, then stopped and waited through the long winter beside its dead rider. The loyalty of the horse somehow made the tragedy even more heartbreaking. Frontier families began to realize that they were facing something unprecedented. Old-timers who had lived through previous hard winters admitted they'd never seen anything like this so early in the season. If November was this brutal, what would January and February bring? The question hung unspoken in the frozen air, and nobody really wanted to hear the answer. Supply trains trying to reach frontier settlements struggled through the snow. Railroads, still relatively new to many parts of the West, discovered that their track wasn't designed for these conditions. Snow drifted over the rails faster than it could be cleared. Locomotives became snowbound, their passengers stranded for days in unheated cars. Supplies that were desperately needed in isolated towns sat in railroad cars buried in snow, tantalizingly close, but completely inaccessible. The isolation that had always been a feature of frontier life now became potentially deadly. Towns that depended on regular deliveries of food, fuel, medicine, and other necessities suddenly found themselves cut off. What supplies they had on hand would have to last however long it took for the railroads to get moving again. Storekeepers began rationing, limiting how much individuals could purchase to try to make supplies stretch further. This wasn't popular, but it was necessary. Mail service, the primary means of communication between frontier settlements and the rest of the world, became sporadic at best. Mail carriers who normally made their rounds on horseback or in light wagons found the routes impassable. Letters from worried relatives back east asking about conditions went unanswered for weeks or months because there was simply no way to deliver them. This lack of communication added another layer of anxiety to an already stressful situation. In homes across the frontier, families gathered closer around their stoves and tried to maintain hope. Parents told their children stories, sang songs, played simple games, anything to pass the long dark hours of confinement. The psychological toll of being trapped indoors day after day, week after week, with no certain knowledge of when conditions might improve, was significant. Cabin fever wasn't just an expression. It was a real condition that could drive people to despair or worse. But there was also a kind of grim determination that frontier life cultivated. These were people who had already made enormous sacrifices to build new lives in a harsh land. They had endured droughts, grasshopper plagues, tornadoes, floods, and 100 other hardships. They could endure this too, they would endure this. The alternative was unthinkable, and so they rationed their food, husbanded their fuel, maintained their shelters, cared for their animals as best they could, and waited for winter to release its grip. December brought more of the same. Storm after storm swept across the plains, each adding more snow, each bringing more bitter cold. The sun, when it appeared at all, was a pale ghost providing little warmth. Temperatures that rose above zero during the day felt almost balmy compared to the 30 and 40 below zero readings that had become commonplace at night. In Montana, Wyoming, and Dakota Territory, conditions were particularly severe. The northern ranges that had been so overstocked with cattle now became killing fields. Cattle drifted with the wind until they reached obstacles like fences, creek banks, or hills. There they would pile up, sometimes hundreds of animals packed tightly together, seeking shelter from the wind. As the storms continued, more animals would press in, crushing those in the middle. Snow would drift over the entire mass, entombing them. By spring, these cattle graveyards would dot the landscape, silent testimony to nature's power and human miscalculation. Ranch hands who ventured out in the storms described scenes of apocalyptic horror. Cattle standing frozen upright where they had finally stopped moving, their eyes glazed with ice. Cows and calves frozen together, the mother having tried to the end to protect her young. Steers with their heads pushed against fence lines, having died while seeking shelter that the fence prevented them from reaching. The cattle weren't just dying. They were dying in ways that spoke of desperation and suffering that haunted the men who witnessed it. The financial implications were beginning to dawn on investors and ranch managers. Each dead cow represented a significant loss. A mature steer that might sell for $30 to $40 was now just frozen meat that would rot when it finally thawed. Multiply those losses by thousands or tens of thousands of animals, and the scale of the disaster became clear. Ranching operations that had been enormously profitable were now facing potential bankruptcy. Dreams of cattle empires were dying alongside the cattle themselves. But in December, the full magnitude of the catastrophe was still hidden beneath the snow. The cattle that had died were buried, preserved by the cold, waiting for spring to reveal them. Ranch managers filed away their worries, hoping that losses would be limited, that they were overestimating the damage. Perhaps many of the cattle had survived by drifting to more sheltered areas. Perhaps the situation wasn't as bad as it seemed. These comforting lies would be shattered when spring finally arrived. If November and December had been merely severe, January 1887 was catastrophic. The month began with brief moderating temperatures that raised hopes, then dashed them cruelly. On January 9th, a storm system that would be remembered as one of the worst in American history descended on the Great Plains. The storm began in Montana in the early morning hours, bringing with it winds that roared like express trains and temperatures that plummeted to levels that seemed impossible. In Glendive, Montana, an unofficial reading of 35 degrees below zero was recorded. But the official numbers didn't capture the full horror of the conditions. The wind chill made it feel far colder. Exposed flesh froze in less than a minute. Breathing the air felt like inhaling knives. By mid-morning, the storm had swept across Dakota Territory, moving with terrifying speed. Within hours it had reached Nebraska. Everywhere it passed, the storm brought the same apocalyptic conditions. Heavy snow falling so thickly that visibility dropped to zero. Winds gusting to 60 miles per hour or more, driving the snow horizontally and creating drifts that buried entire buildings. And the cold, the terrible killing cold, that seemed to strip the life force from every living thing. The storm dumped 16 inches of new snow in as many hours in some locations. This snow fell on top of what was already on the ground, creating accumulations measured in feet rather than inches. Drifts formed that were 20, 30, even 40 feet deep in places. Buildings were completely buried. Fences disappeared beneath the snow. The landscape was transformed into an alien world of white, where familiar landmarks vanished and navigation became impossible. Temperatures during and after the storm dropped to levels that staggered even experienced frontiersmen. Bismarck, North Dakota, recorded temperatures of 43 degrees below zero on February 1st and 12th. Other locations reported even colder readings, though the accuracy of thermometers at such extreme temperatures was questionable. What wasn't questionable was that the cold was lethal. People who ventured outside inadequately protected could die in 15 minutes or less. Cattle died by the thousands during this storm, not the slow death of starvation that had been claiming them throughout the early winter, but sudden death from the combination of exhaustion, cold, and suffocation. Cattle already weakened by months of inadequate nutrition simply lacked the reserves to survive these extreme conditions. They would hunker down seeking shelter from the wind, and as snow piled up around and over them, they would be buried alive, freezing and suffocating simultaneously. In some areas, the snow was so deep and had drifted so severely that cattle could walk up the drifts and over fences that normally would have contained them. This led to animals wandering far from where they should have been, making spring roundups even more difficult than usual. Other cattle seeking shelter crowded into coulees and draws where snow drifted over them, creating mass graves that wouldn't be discovered until the thaw. The January 9th blizzard lasted for days in many areas. When it finally blew itself out, it was followed by more storms. The entire month was a succession of blizzards and brutal cold, punctuated by brief periods of merely severe weather. There was no relief, no respite, no chance for people or animals to recover before the next storm hit. For humans, survival became the sole focus of existence. All normal activities ceased. Schools closed and stayed closed, businesses shuttered. Social gatherings were impossible. People stayed inside their homes and shelters, burning whatever fuel they had, eating whatever food remained, and praying that their supplies would outlast the winter. The isolation was total and suffocating in its own way. In the ranch country of eastern Montana, one cowboy later described the experience of trying to ride out during the January storms. He had bundled himself in every piece of clothing he owned, wrapped his face in scarves until only his eyes were exposed, and still the cold found ways in. Within minutes of leaving the spunk house, he couldn't feel his fingers despite thick mittens. His face felt frozen beneath the scarves. His horse struggled through belly-deep snow, exhausted within yards. After less than a quarter mile, he turned back, accepting that there was nothing he could do for the cattle. They were on their own, and most of them weren't going to make it. Theodore Roosevelt, who owned ranches in Dakota Territory, was back east during the worst of the winter. He received reports of the devastation by letter and telegram, each message more dire than the last. His ranch managers described conditions that seemed almost incomprehensible to someone sitting in a comfortable New York office. Roosevelt, who would later write extensively about his ranching experiences, began to understand that his investment was rapidly vanishing beneath the snow and ice. The impact wasn't limited to cattle. Wildlife suffered equally. Deer, antelope, and elk died in massive numbers, their carcasses joining those of domestic cattle beneath the snow. Predators like wolves and coyotes found easy prey in the weakened and dying animals, but even they struggled to survive the extreme conditions. Birds died by the thousands, falling frozen from the sky or succumbing to starvation when their food sources disappeared beneath the snow. Even in towns, where people had better shelter and more supplies than isolated ranches, the conditions were desperate. Fuel supplies dwindled as wood and coal were burned faster than anticipated. Food stores decreased as the isolation continued week after week with no resupply trains getting through. Prices for available goods soared as demand far exceeded supply. Families that had been comfortable found themselves rationing food and living in inadequately heated homes because fuel had to be conserved. The telegraph lines that connected frontier towns to the outside world were among the first casualties of the storms. Lines went down under the weight of ice and snow, or were simply snapped by the wind. This left communities completely isolated, unable to call for help or even let the outside world know of their plight. It would be weeks before repair crews could begin to restore communications, and by then, much of the damage would already be done. Medical emergencies became potential death sentences. A child with appendicitis who might have been saved by prompt surgery died because there was no way to get them to a doctor or get a doctor to them. Women died in childbirth because midwives couldn't reach them through the storms. Minor injuries became major problems because they couldn't be properly treated. The winter was a great equalizer that reminded everyone of how thin the veneer of civilization really was. Yet even in the midst of this catastrophe, there were moments of grace and heroism. Neighbours who could barely care for themselves shared what little they had with families in worse condition. Cowboys risked their lives to save a few head of cattle, knowing the effort was largely futile but unable to stand by and do nothing. Teachers kept schools warm and children safe when storms hit during school hours. Communities pulled together because that was the only way any of them would survive. One account from Nebraska told of a farmer who noticed smoke from his neighbour's chimney had stopped. Despite the dangerous conditions, he bundled up and fought his way the half-mile to the neighbour's house. He found the family huddled together, their fire having gone out when they ran out of wood. They were slowly freezing to death, already too hypothermic to help themselves. The farmer got their fire going again, then returned with some of his own wood supply to get them through the next few days. He saved their lives, and in doing so demonstrated the frontier spirit of mutual aid that defined these communities. As January finally drew to a close, the death toll in both human and animal terms was staggering. Approximately 100 people had frozen to death during January alone, caught outside in storms or dying in adequately heated shelters. The number of cattle that died would be measured in the hundreds of thousands, though the exact count wouldn't be known until spring. The worst, however, was not over. Winter still had more in store, and the calendar showed that the coldest months were traditionally January and February. February brought no relief. If anything, the cold intensified. Between January 28th and February 3rd, temperatures across the northern plains plummeted to depths that tested the limits of measurement. Unofficial readings of 63 degrees below zero were reported from Montana. Even if these readings were somewhat exaggerated and thermometer accuracy at such extremes was questionable, the fact remained that the cold was lethal and persistent. The storms continued. Snow that should have stopped falling by now continued to accumulate. Drifts that were already enormous grew larger. The snowpack across the northern plains reached depths not seen in recorded history. Animals that had somehow survived January found themselves facing another month of brutal conditions that their depleted bodies couldn't withstand. Cowboys who had been working for $1 a day found themselves engaged in the grim task of trying to save whatever cattle they could. They devised desperate measures to cope with the conditions. Some men would plunge their boots into water, then stand outside until the water froze, creating a layer of ice that provided crude insulation. Others wrapped their faces in black coal dust and rags to prevent snow blindness from the constant glare of sunlight on snow. Many developed frostbite on their faces, hands, and feet despite these precautions. The physical toll on the cowboys themselves was severe. Men who had been hardy and strong at the start of winter found themselves gaunt and weakened. Constant exposure to extreme cold, inadequate nutrition, exhaustion from fighting through snow day after day, all took their toll. Some cowboys froze to death in their saddles, discovered only when the snow melted in spring. Their bodies were stacked in snowbanks or storage sheds until the ground thawed enough to dig graves. In Great Falls, Montana, cattle made it into town seeking any shelter they could find. The desperate animals ate trees, bushes, and garbage, anything that might provide nutrition. Residents watched in horror as cattle that had once been the pride of prosperous ranches were reduced to scavenging like wild animals. The sight of these starving, frozen, desperate creatures wandering through town streets was a stark reminder of how completely the cattle industry had collapsed. The weather pattern that had established itself seemed impossible to break. Cold air from Canada continued to pour south across the plains. Storm systems tracked across the region with monotonous regularity. The usual moderating influences that might bring a January thaw or a warm Chinook wind simply didn't materialize. It was as if nature had decided to demonstrate beyond any doubt who was really in control. Families that had been coping reasonably well earlier in the winter found their supplies running dangerously low. Food that was supposed to last through March was being consumed in February. Fuel supplies that should have been adequate were burning faster than anticipated due to the extreme cold. People began making calculations that no one should have to make about how long their remaining supplies would last, and what they would do if winter continued beyond those limits. Children, confined indoors for months, showed signs of what we would now recognize as depression and anxiety. The normal exuberance of childhood was dampened by the oppressive weight of confinement and the anxiety of the adults around them. Some children forgot what it felt like to run and play outdoors. The winter was stealing their childhood in ways that would leave lasting marks. Adults struggled with their own psychological challenges. The constant worry about survival, the isolation from normal social contact, the oppressive darkness of short winter days, and the noise of wind that never seemed to stop all combined to create a mental burden that was sometimes as heavy as the physical hardships. Some people simply broke under the strain, succumbing to despair or developing what we would now recognize as severe depression. Yet even in February's depths, there were signs of incredible resilience. Families that had lost everything maintained their dignity and hope. Children continued to learn even when schools were closed, with parents teaching from whatever books they had. Communities that were cut off from the outside world created their own entertainment and support systems. The human spirit proved remarkably durable even under these extreme conditions. Ranch managers began to accept what they had been trying to deny. The industry was facing a catastrophe that would reshape everything. Letters and reports sent east when communications were briefly restored painted a grim picture. Losses were far worse than anyone had anticipated. Some operations had lost 70, 80, even 90% of their herds. The financial implications were stunning. Millions of dollars in investment had literally frozen to death on the range. In Dakota Territory, Theodore Roosevelt surveyed what he could see of his ranches and the surrounding country. What he saw horrified him. He would later write to his friend Henry Cabot Lodge, "Well, we have had a perfect smash-up all through the cattle country of the Northwest. The losses are crippling. For the first time I have been utterly unable to enjoy a visit to my ranch. I shall be glad to get home." The open-range cattle industry, which had seemed like an unstoppable force of American expansion just a year earlier, was dying. The great cattle empires that investors had built were collapsing. Ranchers who had arrived in the West with money and confidence were leaving bankrupt and broken. The era of the cowboy, as it had existed, was ending. Something new would have to take its place if cattle ranching was to continue at all. Finally, in late March, the weather began to moderate. Temperatures rose above freezing during the day. The sun, gaining strength as spring approached, began to have real warmth in it. The snow, which had accumulated to depths of 5, 10, 15 feet in places, began to melt. And with the melt came the revelation of the full scope of the disaster. The thaw came gradually at first, then more rapidly as March turned to April. With each day of above-freezing temperatures, more snow melted, more water ran down the coulees and creeks, and more of the winter's devastation was revealed. What settlers discovered beneath the melting snow exceeded their worst fears. Cattle carcasses were everywhere. As far as the eye could see across the plains, the brown and white bodies of dead cattle dotted the landscape. They lay singly and in groups, frozen in death poses that spoke of their final moments. Some had died standing up, frozen so quickly and thoroughly that they remained upright even in death. Others were piled against fence lines where they had sought shelter from the wind. Still others filled the coulees and draws, layer upon layer of dead animals where herds had tried to escape the storms. Cowboys riding the spring range described the horror in terms that seemed almost unbelievable to those who hadn't seen it themselves. One Montana cowboy recalled that you could ride from dawn to dusk and never lose sight of dead cattle. Another described a creek that was dammed by cattle carcasses, the water backing up and flooding around the grotesque barrier. A third told of coulees so filled with dead animals that they looked like they were paved with cattle. The stench was overwhelming. As temperatures rose, the carcasses that had been frozen and preserved through the winter began to rot. The smell of decay spread across the plains, thick and inescapable. It got into clothing, into homes, into food. Settlers miles away from the worst concentrations of dead cattle could still smell the odor on the wind. For months the smell of death hung over the range country, a constant reminder of winter's toll. Water sources were contaminated by the rotting carcasses. Creeks and rivers carried decomposing cattle downstream, polluting the water for miles. Wells were tainted by seepage from dead animals. Drinking water had to be carefully sourced and often boiled before use. The cattle that had been such a source of wealth had become a massive environmental and health hazard. The task of dealing with the carcasses was overwhelming. Some ranchers organized crews to skin the dead animals, salvaging at least the hides which still had some commercial value. The work was gruesome and exhausting. Cowboys had to approach each carcass, often bloated and decomposing, cut off the hide, and leave the skinned body for scavengers. It took months to work through even a fraction of the dead animals, and many carcasses were never processed at all. Other ranchers resorted to burning the carcasses in great piles. Wood was gathered, carcasses were dragged together, and huge pyres were lit that smoked and smouldered for days. The smell of burning flesh added to the existing stench of decay. These funeral pyres for the cattle industry burned across the plains, their smoke visible for miles, marking the end of an era. The financial reckoning was devastating. Operations that had been valued in the millions were suddenly worthless. The Pudra Livestock Company in Colorado had lost 2/3 of its herd, representing losses of $400,000. Alex Swan in Wyoming, whose operation had run over 100,000 head, declared bankruptcy. Small operations and large ones alike faced ruin. In Custer County, Montana, the tax rolls told the story. In 1886, 200 ranchers were listed on the tax rolls. By 1888, only 120 remained. The others had gone bankrupt, sold out, or simply abandoned their operations and left the territory. The same pattern repeated across the northern plains. Dreams of cattle empires died as surely as the cattle themselves. Theodore Roosevelt tallied his losses and found that he had lost more than half his herd. Financially, it was a severe blow. More than that, it represented the death of his ranching dreams. He would continue to visit his Dakota ranches occasionally, but they would never again be the center of his world as they had been. The West had taken something from him that he would never fully recover. The few cattle that survived were in pitiful condition. Gaunt, with ribs and hip bones protruding sharply, many could barely walk. Their hooves were damaged from pouring through frozen snow all winter. Their faces bore scars from pushing through sharp-crusted ice seeking forage. Many had severe frostbite on ears, tails, and other extremities. Some were so weak they couldn't survive the stress of the spring roundup and died despite having made it through the winter itself. Calves born in the spring of 1887 often died because their mothers couldn't produce enough milk to nurse them. The cows were simply too weak and malnourished. Calf survival rates that would normally be 90% or higher dropped to 30 or 40%. Every calf that died represented not just the loss of that animal, but the loss of future breeding stock and future productivity. The marketing of what cattle survived was chaotic and desperate. Ranchers needed to sell animals to generate any cash flow at all, but the market was glutted with cattle from all the distressed operations trying to liquidate. Prices collapsed. Cattle that would normally fetch $30 or $40 were selling for $10 or $15. Some ranchers were forced to accept virtually any offer just to move their stock and get some return on their investment. The human toll of the winter also became clear that spring. The exact number of people who died would never be precisely known. Many of those who perished were isolated homesteaders, whose deaths might not be discovered for months or even years. Cowboys who froze to death on the range might never be found, their bodies decomposing in some remote coulee, but the estimates suggested that several hundred people had died across the plains during the winter of 1886 to 1887. Communities across the frontier held memorial services for those who had been lost. Sometimes these were for specific individuals whose deaths were known and confirmed. Other times they were general services acknowledging all the unknown dead, the people who had simply vanished during the winter, and who everyone presumed had perished. These services were somber affairs where the fragility of life on the frontier was openly acknowledged. The survivors of the winter bore scars both visible and invisible. Many suffered from lasting effects of frostbite, having lost fingers, toes, ears, or noses to the cold. Others had respiratory problems from breathing extremely cold air or from smoke inhalation from poor ventilation in sealed-up homes. The psychological trauma was harder to see but no less real. Many people who had survived the winter were changed by it in fundamental ways, yet there was also a kind of pride among the survivors. They had faced one of nature's greatest challenges and endured. They had learned profound lessons about preparation, about community, about what really mattered when life was stripped to its essentials. These lessons would inform everything they did going forward. The winter had tested them and found them, if not invincible, at least resilient enough to continue. The landscape itself had changed. Years of overgrazing followed by the severe winter had damaged the range in ways that would take years to heal. Native grass species that took decades to establish were gone from many areas, replaced by less desirable plants or by bare ground. Erosion from spring runoff carved gullies through overgrazed hillsides. The ecological damage added to the economic damage, but even in the midst of this devastation, there were signs of recovery and adaptation. Grass that survived the winter began to green up with the spring rains. Wildlife that had endured returned to familiar territories. Humans, perhaps the most adaptable species of all, began to rebuild and reimagine what ranching in this harsh land would look like going forward. The lesson was clear. The open range era was over. The romantic vision of unlimited herds roaming unfenced grasslands had died along with the cattle. What would replace it was still being figured out, but everyone understood that it would have to be different. Smaller herds, supplemental feeding, winter shelters, fencing to control grazing and protect hayfields. These weren't luxuries or optional improvements. They were necessities if ranching was to continue at all. Some ranchers adapted and thrived. Those who reduced their herd sizes to match what the land could sustainably support, who invested in hay production and storage, who built adequate shelters for their stock, found that ranching could still be profitable. Just not in the massive, quick returns way that had attracted so much investment in the early 1880s. It would be slower, more careful, more respectful of nature's constraints. But it could work. The indigenous peoples who had tried to warn settlers about the coming storm did not say, "I told you so," though they would have been justified in doing so. Instead, many of them shared what remained of their own winter supplies with struggling white families, demonstrating a generosity of spirit that shamed those who had dismissed their warnings. This act of grace helped forge better relationships between native and settler communities in some areas, though such progress was uneven and often temporary. As spring advanced and the snow finally finished melting, settlers began the work of rebuilding their lives and their operations. Fields were prepared for planting. Gardens were planted with extra care, as everyone understood the importance of homegrown food after the privations of winter. Homes and barns damaged by snow load or extreme cold were repaired. Life, that most persistent force, reasserted itself, but even as people moved forward, the memory of the winter remained. It was referenced in conversations, commemorated in local histories, passed down in family stories. The winter of 1886 to 1887 became a watershed moment, a before and after dividing line in frontier history. Things would never be the same as they had been. That world was gone, buried beneath the snow along with the cattle that had defined it, just when settlers thought they had endured the worst nature could offer, just when they were beginning to feel confident in their hard-won survival skills, nature delivered another devastating blow. The winter of 1887 to 1888 was not as severe overall as the previous winter, but it would prove even more deadly in human terms. This was because of one storm, One terrible day that would become known as the Children's Blizzard, or the Schoolhouse Blizzard. The months leading up to January 1888 had been harsh. November 1887 brought ice storms and frigid temperatures. December saw snowfall measuring up to 40 inches in some areas. By early January, the Great Plains were already buried under heavy snow and gripped by cold that seemed it would never break. But settlers had survived the previous winter. They knew what to expect. They were prepared, or so they thought. January 12th, 1888, dawned with unseasonably mild temperatures. After days of brutal cold, the morning felt almost balmy in comparison. Some areas saw temperatures well above freezing, warm enough that snow was melting and icicles were dripping. It was the kind of January thaw that frontier residents welcomed, a brief respite from winter's grip. The mild morning deceived people into venturing out without adequate protection. Children who had been kept home during the previous frigid days begged to go to school, and parents relented. After all, the weather seemed to be improving. Farmers and ranchers went about outdoor tasks that had been impossible during the recent cold snap. People travelling between settlements set out confident that conditions would remain reasonable. The trap was being set, and nature was about to spring it. Lieutenant Thomas Mayhew Woodruff, the forecaster at the United States Weather Service office in St. Paul, Minnesota, saw signs that concerned him. His instruments showed a cold front approaching from the northwest. The day before, he had drafted a warning about a cold wave coming to Dakota and Nebraska, with heavy snowdrifts predicted. But Woodruff was relatively new to his position and worried about issuing too many alarming predictions that might not materialize. He modified his warning to make it less urgent before sending it out via Western Union telegraph. The warning, such as it was, never reached most of the people who needed it. In rural areas where most people lived, there were no telephones, no radios, no television, no internet. Information spread slowly, if at all. The warning Woodruff issued was posted at some Western Union offices and published in some newspapers, but most frontier residents had no way of knowing it existed. They based their decisions on what they could see and feel themselves, and what they saw and felt that morning was pleasant weather. The storm system itself was remarkable in its violence and speed. A low-pressure system had been strengthening in Canada's Northwest Territories. On January 11th, it dropped south-southeastward into central Montana, then into northeastern Colorado. Behind this system came an Arctic cold front of exceptional intensity. The collision of warm tropical air that had moved north from the Gulf of Mexico with this brutal cold created conditions for catastrophe. By mid-morning on January 12th, the sky began to change in areas of Montana and Dakota Territory. Settlers who were paying attention noticed a strange colour on the northwestern horizon, a purple-yellow hue that seemed unnatural and threatening. The wind, which had been calm or gentle, began to increase. Animals sensed what was coming before humans did. Cattle huddled together. Horses became restless. Birds fell silent or took wing, seeking shelter. Around midday, some areas heard a sound that survivors would describe repeatedly, a roar like a freight train approaching. It was the sound of the cold front itself, the wind at the leading edge of the storm, moving at incredible speed and carrying with it the full fury of an Arctic blast. Then the storm hit, and in minutes the world was transformed. Temperatures dropped with stunning rapidity. In some locations, the mercury fell from above 40 degrees Fahrenheit to below zero in a matter of hours. One weather station recorded the temperature at 44 degrees at 2 in the afternoon, -11 degrees at 9 in the evening, and an overnight low of -42 degrees. A drop of nearly 90 degrees in less than 12 hours. Human bodies couldn't adapt to such rapid change. Clothing that had been adequate in the morning was utterly insufficient by afternoon. The wind screamed across the plains at speeds approaching 60 miles per hour. Not the steady wind of a typical storm, but gusting, swirling wind that seemed to come from all directions at once. This wind picked up the snow that was already on the ground, and the new snow that was falling, creating whiteout conditions where visibility dropped to 0. You literally could not see your hand in front of your face. The air itself became a churning mass of wind and snow that obscured everything. The timing of the storm's arrival was catastrophic. It hit during the early afternoon when children were in school, when farmers and ranchers were out doing chores, when travellers were between destinations. People were caught in the open with no shelter and no way to navigate in the blinding snow. What should have been simple, familiar journeys became deadly traps. In schoolhouses across Nebraska, Dakota Territory, Minnesota, and other affected areas, teachers faced an impossible choice. Keep the children at school and try to keep them warm through what would likely be a very cold night, or send them home while there might still be a chance of making it before the worst of the storm arrived. Some teachers made one choice, some made the other. For some, the choice meant the difference between life and death for their students. In Groton, South Dakota, teacher Seymour H. Dopp watched the sky darken around 10:30 in the morning and made his decision. His 17 students would stay at the schoolhouse. They would burn whatever fuel they had, and if that ran out, they would burn desks, benches, whatever would burn. The building stayed warm through the night. The next morning, worried parents made their way through 5-foot snowdrifts to find their children safe, hungry, but alive. Dopp's decision saved their lives. In Plainview, Nebraska, teacher Lois Royce made a different decision. When the storm hit, she decided to lead her 3 students to her boarding house, which was only 82 yards away. In normal conditions, it was less than a minute's walk. In the blizzard, they became lost immediately. The visibility was so poor that they couldn't see the building they were trying to reach even from that short distance. The 3 children, 2 9-year-old boys and a 6-year-old girl, froze to death. Royce survived, but her feet were so severely frostbitten that both had to be amputated. The most famous story from the children's blizzard was that of Minnie Mae Freeman, a 19-year-old teacher near Ord in central Nebraska. Freeman was teaching at the Midvale Country Schoolhouse, with 13 students ranging in age from young children to teenagers nearly as old as she was. When the storm hit shortly after noon, the wind was so powerful that it tore the tar paper and sod roof completely off the schoolhouse. The building, which had seemed adequate shelter, was suddenly open to the elements. Freeman knew they would freeze if they stayed. She also knew that her home was about 1.5 miles away, but she thought she could find her way there even in the blizzard. Some accounts say she tied the children together with a rope to keep them together. Others dispute this detail. What is certain is that she led all 13 children through the storm to her home, and all of them survived. Her heroism made her an instant celebrity. She received more than 80 marriage proposals in the aftermath of the storm. A song was written about Nebraska's fearless maid. Her story became the one bright spot in a day of overwhelming tragedy. But for every story like Minnie Freeman's, there were many others that ended in heartbreak. At a school near Garrison, Nebraska, 3 children of John Denlinger attempted to walk home when the storm hit. They became lost and spent the night outside. When they were found the next morning, one was dead from exposure. The other two barely survived. Near Canton in Dakota Territory, 2 children of the Fitzgerald family were caught in the storm while going home from school and perished. A little boy named Wexel Beck started home from school about 3 in the afternoon and was never seen alive again. Another boy named George Allen started home at about the same time and also died in the storm. The Chicago Daily Inter-Ocean published accounts of these tragedies on January 14th, just 2 days after the blizzard. But by then, it was far too late for warnings or preparations. The damage was done. Adults caught in the storm fared little better than children. A farmer named N.E. Turner had driven to town in his wagon on the morning of January 12th. When the storm hit, he was on his way home. He kept going because he knew his family would be worried, driving his team through conditions that rapidly became impossible. When he finally arrived home, he was encased in ice more than 2 inches thick. His beard had become a solid mass of ice. Only by constant effort had he kept his eyes from freezing shut. He had guided his team more by instinct than vision, trusting the horses to find their way when he could no longer see the road. A stagecoach arrived at Camp Supply, a military outpost in Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, with its passengers relieved to have survived the storm. Only then did they discover that their driver had frozen to death on top of the coach. He had died sitting upright in his seat, his body preserved by the cold, while the horses had continued on without human guidance, bringing their passengers to safety even though their driver could not. In Minnesota, a 36-year-old Scottish immigrant farmer named James Jackson discovered his entire cattle herd frozen to death in a 10-mile stretch. The animals had drifted with the wind until exhaustion and cold overcame them, then died where they stood. Jackson's entire livelihood was gone in a single day. Charles Morse, founder of the Lake Benton News newspaper, returned to his home to find the door had been forced open by the wind and his entire stairway was packed with snow. His bed was covered with several inches of snow that had filtered through cracks around his door and keyhole. Stories of tragedy and near tragedy multiplied across the affected region. A herder named Forrestel went for a long ride on horseback and froze 3 fingers on his right hand and 2 on his left, so badly that amputation was considered necessary. He was one of countless people who suffered permanent injury from the storm. Newspapers in the days following the blizzard were filled with accounts of death and disaster, each brief paragraph representing a personal tragedy, a family destroyed, a future ended. The suddenness of the storm was what made it so deadly. If the brutal conditions had been present in the morning, schools would not have opened and people would have stayed home. But the warm morning deceived everyone. Carl Solti, a teenage Norwegian immigrant in Fortier, Minnesota, remembered that at noon on January 12th, it was so warm that snow and ice melted from windows. By 3:30 in the afternoon, he recalled, a dark and heavy wall built up around the northwest coming fast, coming like those heavy thunderstorms like a shot. In a few moments, we had the severest snowstorm I ever saw in my life with a terrible hard wind like a hurricane. Snow so thick we could not see more than 3 steps from the door at times. The Boston Daily Advertiser reported under the headline Midnight at Noon that at Fargo the mercury hit 47 degrees below zero with hurricane-force winds blowing. At Nesh in Dakota Territory, the thermometer registered 58 degrees below zero. These temperatures, combined with the wind, created wind chill factors that were instantly lethal to anyone inadequately protected. The storm's impact extended beyond immediate deaths. Many survivors suffered severe frostbite that resulted in amputations weeks or months later. Respiratory problems from breathing the extremely cold air affected people for the rest of their lives. The psychological trauma of surviving the storm, especially for children who had seen classmates die, created lasting mental health impacts that we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Families that lost children were devastated in ways that shaped the rest of their lives. In an era of high child mortality, parents were sadly accustomed to the possibility of losing children to disease or accident. But the sudden, violent nature of the blizzard deaths, the knowledge that children had frozen to death while trying to reach the safety of home, added an extra layer of grief that many parents never overcame. Communities erected memorials to the children who died. In St. John's Ridgely Cemetery in Nebraska, school children contributed pennies to erect a monument over the grave of two sisters, Ida and Matilda Westphalen, who died together in the storm. The monument's inscription read, "Sacred to the memory of Ida G. and Matilda M., daughters of Peter and Catherine Westphalen, who perished in the great blizzard of Yanagias 12, 1888. It stood as a permanent reminder of that terrible day. When the storm finally ended on January 13th, the death toll began to be tallied. By the time all reports were compiled, between 235 and 500 people were confirmed dead or missing and presumed dead. The exact number would never be known because many victims were isolated homesteaders whose deaths might not be discovered until spring or later. The storm affected 3 states, Nebraska, Kansas, and Minnesota, and 5 territories, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, an area of hundreds of thousands of square miles. The children's blizzard became a defining event in the cultural memory of the Great Plains. Stories were passed down through generations. Survivors interviewed decades later by the Works Progress Administration, Federal Writers Project in the 1930s, could still recall every detail of that terrible day. The blizzard influenced art and literature. In 1967, a Venetian glass mural depicting Minnie Freeman leading her students to safety was installed in the Nebraska State Capitol building, ensuring that her heroism would be remembered. The storm also spurred some changes in how frontier communities prepared for winter. Schools began to stockpile more fuel and emergency supplies in case students and teachers had to spend the night. Families became more cautious about allowing children to walk long distances to school during winter months. Rope guidelines connecting houses to barns and other outbuildings, which some families had already implemented, became more common as people recognized that you could literally become lost between your house and barn in a bad blizzard. But the fundamental lesson of the children's blizzard was one that the Great Die-Up had already taught. Nature was more powerful than human ambition or preparation. The plains environment demanded respect and caution. Those who learned this lesson and adapted accordingly could survive and even thrive. Those who didn't learn it the hard way, if they survived to learn it at all. Just 2 months after the children's blizzard devastated the Great Plains, another massive storm system took aim at a different part of the country. The Great Blizzard of 1888, also known as the Great White Hurricane, struck the eastern seaboard from Delaware to Maine on March 11th through 14th, 1888. While it affected a different region with a very different population and infrastructure, it was in many ways just as devastating as the western storms. The weekend of March 10th began pleasantly in the northeast. Saturday brought unseasonably warm weather that felt like early spring. Grass was greening up, birds were chirping, trees were beginning to bud. Temperatures were in the 50s, and people were outdoors enjoying the mild conditions. After a typically harsh northeastern winter, This early glimpse of spring was especially welcome. No one suspected that one of the worst storms in American history was about to arrive. Sunday afternoon, the weather began to change. Temperatures dropped suddenly. Rain began to fall, light at first, then heavier. The wind picked up, though not yet to alarming levels. People prepared for an ordinary late winter storm, the kind that happened occasionally when spring's advance was temporarily reversed. They went to bed Sunday night expecting perhaps a few inches of snow and some inconvenient weather before things improved again. Monday morning, March 12th, revealed a transformed world. The rain had changed to snow during the night, and it was falling heavily. The wind had increased dramatically, now gusting at sustained speeds of more than 50 miles per hour, with gusts even higher. Before the storm was over, winds of 85 miles per hour would be recorded in New York City. These were hurricane-force winds, but instead of driving rain, they drove snow. The snow fell continuously for the next 3 days. Total accumulations range from 10 inches in some areas to 58 inches in others. Most areas receive between 20 and 40 inches. But the raw accumulation was only part of the story. The powerful winds drove this snow into drifts that reached astonishing heights. Drifts of 30 to 50 feet were common. Some exceeded 50 feet. Entire houses were buried. Streets became impassable canyons of snow. New York City, the nation's largest and most modern metropolis, was brought to a complete standstill. Above-ground transportation ceased entirely. Elevated railway lines were blocked by snow and ice. Horse-drawn vehicles couldn't move. The few automobiles that existed were utterly useless. People were trapped wherever the storm found them, whether in their homes, in their workplaces, or caught outside. The economic impact was immediate and severe. At the time, approximately 1 in every 4 Americans lived in the region affected by the storm. The shutdown of transportation and commerce in America's commercial and financial capital had ripple effects throughout the national economy. The New York Stock Exchange closed. Banks shut down. Businesses lost revenue not just for the days the storm raged, but for weeks afterward as they struggled to recover. The death toll was devastating. Estimates of those killed by the storm range from 400 to 800, with the true number likely near the higher end of that range. In New York City alone, at least 200 people died. Many were workers who had gone to their jobs despite the weather because they couldn't afford to miss work. The city's economy was struggling at the time, and missing even a day's wages could mean not being able to feed your family. These workers found themselves trapped when the storm intensified. Some tried to make it home and died in the streets, sometimes within sight of their destination. Others died in snowdrifts, buried so quickly that they had no chance to escape. Bodies were found days or weeks later as the snow melted, some in downtown Manhattan, some in more rural areas where people had been caught traveling between towns. The fire department was unable to respond to fires because fire engines couldn't move through the snow. Several buildings burned during the storm, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. People trapped in burning buildings had to choose between burning or facing the storm, and both choices could be fatal. The powerlessness that citizens and authorities felt in the face of the blizzard was profoundly disturbing for a city that prided itself on modernity and capability. Telegraph and telephone lines came down across the region, cutting off communications. The storm isolated the East Coast from the rest of the country, just as effectively as the winter storms had isolated prairie settlements. Ironically, many Easterners had read about the western blizzards and cattle. die up with a kind of detached sympathy, viewing them as tragedies that happened to people foolish enough to settle in such harsh environments. Now they were experiencing their own version of nature's fury and learning humility. The railroad system, which had been expanding rapidly and was considered a triumph of modern engineering, proved vulnerable to the blizzard. Trains became snowbound across the region. Some sat for days with passengers trapped inside, running low on food, water, and fuel. Efforts to rescue stranded trains were often unsuccessful, as rescue trains themselves became stuck. The entire transportation network that connected the northeast ground to a halt. The blizzard had some positive long-term consequences despite its immediate devastation. The storm convinced New York City and other major cities that critical infrastructure needed to be placed underground. Over the following years, telegraph and telephone lines were moved below ground. The subway system was expanded, providing transportation that couldn't be blocked by surface snow. Steam and water lines were buried deeper to prevent freezing. These improvements made cities more resilient to future winter storms. The storm also led to improvements in weather forecasting. The Weather Bureau's failure to predict the severity of the March blizzard led to increased investment in meteorological science, better instrumentation, and more systematic observation and prediction methods. While weather forecasting would remain imperfect for decades to come, the lessons from 1888 spurred progress that eventually saved many lives. For individuals caught in the storm, survival often came down to luck and quick thinking. Some people were able to seek shelter in buildings close to where the storm caught them. Churches, schools, and other public buildings became temporary shelters for hundreds of people. Others had to survive outdoors, sometimes for hours before reaching safety. The stories of survival and tragedy from the March blizzard paralleled those from the western storms, proving that nature's power transcended geography. The recovery from the Great Blizzard took weeks. The sheer volume of snow that had to be moved was staggering. Initially, workers simply threw snow into the streets to clear sidewalks, but this made the streets impassable. Eventually, the snow had to be loaded into wagons and carts and hauled away, a monumental task that employed thousands of men. Even after the streets were cleared, massive piles of snow remained throughout the cities well into April. The economic cost was estimated at $20 million in 1888 currency, equivalent to hundreds of millions in today's money. Businesses lost revenue. Property was damaged. The cost of cleanup and recovery was enormous. Yet the region recovered, rebuilt, and adapted. The resilience shown by eastern city dwellers facing the March blizzard was not so different from the resilience of western settlers facing their own series of storms. The three great storms of the late 1880s, the winter of 1886 to 1887, the Children's Blizzard of January 1888, and the Great Blizzard of March 1888, together represented a watershed moment in American history. They revealed the limits of human ambition in the face of nature's power. They demonstrated that neither the frontier nor the cities were immune to catastrophe. They spurred changes in how Americans prepared for and responded to extreme weather. The aftermath of these devastating storms forced fundamental changes in how Americans, particularly those on the Great Plains, approached the challenges of living in a harsh environment. The open-range cattle industry never recovered in its previous form. The era of massive unfenced herds roaming freely across public lands was finished. What emerged to replace it was smaller scale, more intensive, more scientific, and ultimately more sustainable. The surviving ranchers who rebuilt their operations did so with hard-won wisdom. Herd sizes were reduced dramatically. Where operations had run 50 or 80,000 head, they now managed 10 or 15,000. This reduction allowed the range to recover from years of overgrazing and provided better nutrition for the animals that remained. Healthier cattle were more likely to survive hard winters and produced better quality beef. Winter feeding became standard practice rather than an exception. Ranchers began growing or purchasing hay to supplement winter grazing. This meant dedicating land to hay production rather than just grazing, reducing the number of cattle that could be supported but increasing their survival rates. Hay storage facilities, virtually non-existent before the die-up, became common features of ranch operations. Fencing spread rapidly across the plains despite the expense. Barbed wire, patented in the 1870s but not widely used on the open range, became standard. Fences allowed ranchers to control grazing patterns, protect hay fields, keep cattle closer to water and shelter, and generally manage their operations much more intensively. The vast, unfenced expanses that had characterized the open range era became divided into more manageable units. Shelters and windbreaks became priorities. Ranchers built barns and sheds to protect cattle during the worst weather. They planted trees to create windbreaks that could reduce wind chill and provide some protection. In some areas, natural features like coulees and hills were fenced to create protected zones where cattle could shelter during storms. These investments cost money, but proved their worth during subsequent hard winters. Breed selection changed as well. The Texas Longhorns that had been driven north in massive numbers were hardy, but didn't produce high-quality beef. After the die-up, ranchers began introducing other breeds, particularly British breeds like Hereford and Angus, that produced better quality meat. These breeds required more care and better feed than Longhorns, but the improved market prices justified the additional investment. The role of the cowboy changed dramatically. The romantic figure of the cowboy driving cattle on long trail drives became obsolete as railroads reached deeper into cattle country and as fencing eliminated open ranges. Cowboys became ranch hands whose work centered around fence maintenance, hay production, winter feeding, and herd management rather than long rides and dramatic roundups. It was more prosaic work but also steadier employment with better pay. Small ranchers who had survived the die-up often did better in the new era than the large operations had done under the old system. Small operations could provide more intensive management, respond more quickly to changing conditions, and adapt more easily to new methods. The cattle industry became more distributed, with many moderate-sized operations replacing the massive empires that had dominated the open range era. Farmers also adapted their practices based on lessons from the hard winters. Crop selection shifted toward hardier varieties. More emphasis was placed on food crops for family consumption rather than cash crops that might fail. Root cellars and food storage became more sophisticated. Homes were better insulated and more tightly constructed. These changes gradually made frontier life safer and more sustainable. The government also responded to the disasters. The Weather Service received additional funding and expanded its network of observation stations. Forecasting methods improved, though reliable long-range weather prediction remained elusive. Agricultural extension services were established to help farmers and ranchers adopt better practices. Land management policies began to recognize that not all land was suitable for intensive use. Indigenous peoples, whose warnings before the 1886 winter had been largely ignored, found some validation when white settlers began paying more attention to traditional weather knowledge. Some ranchers and farmers sought out native teachers who could help them learn to read natural signs. This didn't undo the injustices of displacement and broken treaties, but it did represent a small step toward respecting indigenous knowledge. Schools in frontier areas implemented new policies to protect children. Many schools stocked several days' worth of food and fuel so that students and teachers could shelter in place if a storm struck during school hours. Some schools installed guide ropes from the building to nearby homes to help children navigate in poor visibility. Parents became more cautious about sending children to distant schools during winter months. The broader cultural impact of the storms was significant. The romantic myth of the West as a land of unlimited opportunity, where hard work guaranteed success, was tempered by recognition that nature could destroy even the best prepared operations. Stories of the die-up and the blizzards became part of Western folklore, passed down through generations as cautionary tales and as proof of the resilience of those who survived. Art and literature reflected the impact of these events. Artists like Charlie Russell painted scenes of the hard winter. Writers incorporated the cattle die-up into their novels and histories. The children's blizzard inspired poems, songs, and stories. These artistic works kept the memory alive and helped process the trauma of what had happened. Financially, the impact continued for years. Banks that had lent money to failed ranching operations faced their own crises. Insurance companies that had covered cattle learned harsh lessons about underwriting risk in unpredictable environments. Eastern and European investors became much more cautious about Western ventures. Capital still flowed to the West, but more carefully and with better understanding of the risks involved. The human stories from these storms remained vivid for generations. Survivors told and retold their experiences to children and grandchildren. The names of heroes like Minnie Freeman became legendary. The locations of tragedy, like the school where the Estphalen sisters died, became places of memory. Communities developed shared narratives about the hard winter that helped bind them together and define their identity. The environmental recovery took decades. Overgrazed rangeland gradually healed as cattle numbers decreased and grazing management improved. Native grass species that had been suppressed by overgrazing began to recover. Wildlife populations that had crashed during the hard winters slowly rebuilt. The plains ecosystem demonstrated remarkable resilience when given a chance to recover. Perhaps the most important lesson from these storms was about the relationship between humans and nature. The open-range cattle industry had been based on the assumption that nature could be dominated, that the environment would conform to human desires and economic plans. The hard winter taught that nature set the terms and humans had to adapt or perish. This was a harsh lesson, paid for in lives and livelihoods, but an essential one. Those who learned this lesson and adjusted their practices accordingly found that the plains could still support successful ranching and farming, just not on the unlimited scale that early promoters had promised. The sustainable ranching operations that emerged from the disaster proved more stable and longer-lasting than the speculative empires that collapsed. Working with nature rather than against it turned out to be not just more ethical, but more profitable in the long run. Modern descendants of those who survived the hard winters often speak with pride about their ancestors' resilience. The ability to survive and rebuild after such catastrophic losses says something important about human adaptability and determination. The hard winters didn't destroy the frontier, but they did fundamentally reshape it, creating a more realistic and sustainable approach to living in a challenging environment. As we complete this journey through one of the darkest chapters in frontier history, it's worth reflecting on what these events mean for us today, more than a century later. The specific circumstances of the 1880s may seem remote from our modern experience, but the fundamental lessons remain relevant. Climate remains unpredictable and potentially deadly despite all our technological advances. We have better forecasting now, better infrastructure, better emergency response systems. Yet nature still surprises us. Polar vortexes bring extreme cold to regions unprepared for it. Hurricanes strengthen rapidly and strike with devastating force. Wildfires, droughts, and floods continue to reshape landscapes and destroy communities. The tools we use to cope have improved, but nature's power has not diminished. The hubris that led to the cattle die-up, the assumption that past patterns would continue and that we could manage nature to suit our purposes, remains a human tendency. We build in floodplains and are shocked when floods come. We settle in fire-prone areas and are devastated when fires arrive. We assume that average conditions will persist and are unprepared when extremes occur. The specific mistakes may differ, but the underlying pattern of overconfidence in our control over natural systems continues. The importance of heeding warnings from those with deeper knowledge of an environment also remains relevant. The indigenous peoples who warned of the hard winter were ignored, just as scientists warning about climate change are sometimes dismissed. Traditional knowledge gained through generations of observation is frequently undervalued in favor of more recent but less tested approaches. We continue to pay prices for this dismissal. Community resilience and mutual aid, which proved essential for frontier survival, remain crucial in our own era. When disasters strike, whether natural or man-made, communities that help each other and share resources fare better than those where everyone is isolated and self-focused. The networks of mutual obligation that held frontier communities together have modern equivalents in disaster response teams, community organizations, and simple neighborliness. The psychological impacts of trauma, which affected survivors of the hard winters and blizzards in ways that lasted lifetimes, are now better understood but remain challenging to address. We have better mental health resources than frontier communities had, but we still struggle to help people process and recover from traumatic experiences. The children who survived the 1888 blizzard carried that trauma forever. So do survivors of modern disasters. The tension between economic development and environmental sustainability that the cattle die-up made visible remains central to contemporary debates. How many cattle can the land support sustainably? How much water can we draw from aquifers? How much carbon can the atmosphere absorb? The specific questions have changed, but the underlying issue of limits remains. The hard winter taught that exceeding environmental limits has consequences. That lesson still applies. The value of preparation and resilience infrastructure, the rope guidelines between buildings, the stockpiled food and fuel, the adequate shelters, these prudent measures meant the difference between life and death on the frontier. Today we have different preparedness challenges, emergency supplies, backup power, evacuation plans, resilient infrastructure. But the principle remains the same. Preparation matters. Resilience can be built. Those who prepare fare better than those who don't. The recognition that rapid change can occur and that we must be able to adapt quickly is increasingly relevant in our fast-changing world. The settlers who adapted their ranching practices after the die-up survived. Those who clung to old methods failed. In an era of rapid technological, economic, and environmental change, adaptability is more crucial than ever. The ability to learn from experience and adjust course quickly can determine survival and success. The importance of accurate information and effective communication in crisis situations highlighted by the inadequate warning systems before the children's blizzard, has only increased. We have better communication technology now, but that doesn't guarantee that warnings will reach everyone who needs them, or that people will respond appropriately. The challenge of getting life-saving information to vulnerable populations during emergencies remains very real. As you lie there listening to this story, perhaps feeling the warmth of your bed or the comfort of your home, consider for a moment what it would be like if that comfort were stripped away. If you were cold and it wasn't just uncomfortable but dangerous. If you were hungry and it wasn't just unpleasant but potentially fatal. If you were isolated and it lasted not hours but months. The frontier experience seems remote from modern life, but the underlying vulnerabilities humans face haven't changed as much as we like to think. The men, women and children who lived through the winter of 1886 to 1887 and the blizzards of 1888 were ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. They weren't superhuman. They were people like us, with the same basic capacities and limitations. What they demonstrated was that ordinary people, when tested, can find reserves of strength, courage, and endurance they didn't know they possessed. Their stories remind us that hardship, while not something to seek out, can reveal and strengthen character. The survivors of the hard winter often said they wouldn't wish that experience on anyone, but they also acknowledged that it changed them in ways they valued. It taught them what truly mattered. It showed them what they were capable of. It connected them to their communities in profound ways. These are lessons that can't be learned from books or lectures. They have to be lived. The frontier chapter of American history closed decades ago. The last homesteaders proved up on their claims. The open range disappeared beneath fences. The cowboys became ranch hands, then mechanics and office workers. The hard winters that killed hundreds of thousands of cattle and hundreds of people became stories told around campfires and dinner tables. Then entries in history books, now episodes in podcasts like this one. But the spirit of those who survived remains relevant. The determination to persist in the face of overwhelming odds. The willingness to help neighbors even at personal cost. The ability to find hope in desperate circumstances. The capacity to learn from disaster and build something better. These qualities transcend time and place. They're as valuable now as they were on the winter frontier. As you drift towards sleep tonight, safe and warm, spare a thought for those long-ago people huddled around their stoves, wondering if they had enough food to last until spring, wondering if the cold would finally breach their walls, wondering if they would see their neighbors again, or if winter had claimed them. And perhaps feel gratitude for the comforts we take for granted, the warmth, the abundance, the safety, the connection. But also remember that those comforts aren't guaranteed forever. Nature remains powerful, disasters still happen. We may never face exactly what the frontier settlers faced, but we will face our own tests. When we do, we can draw strength from knowing that others before us faced even worse and survived. The human capacity for resilience, for adaptation, for mutual aid, for finding meaning even in hardship, these capabilities remain available to us. They're part of our inheritance from those who came before. Sleep well tonight. You are connected through the generations to people who survived the unsurvivable, who endured the unendurable, who found strength they didn't know they had. That same strength lives in you, waiting to be discovered if you need it. The frontier is long gone, but the frontier spirit at its best remains. The winter ended, as all winters do. Spring came to the plains, bringing new grass, new life, new hope. The survivors buried their dead, rebuilt what had been destroyed, and moved forward. They didn't forget what they had endured, but neither did they let it defeat them. They adapted, learned, grew stronger from the testing. That is perhaps the final lesson from America's deadliest winter. Not that we should seek out hardship or romanticize suffering. Not that the deaths and losses were somehow good or necessary. But that humans have a remarkable capacity to survive, to adapt, to support each other, and to find meaning even in the darkest times. When winter comes, as it always eventually does in one form or another, we can face it with courage drawn from those who faced it before us and prevailed. The story of the hard winter and the great blizzards is ultimately a story of human resilience. It's a story worth remembering not because we want to return to those conditions, but because we can learn from how people responded to them. The challenges we face today are different but no less real. Climate change, economic instability, social upheaval, pandemics, all test our capacity to adapt and endure. When those tests come, we can remember the homesteader family that survived months of isolation by careful preparation and mutual support. We can remember the teacher who led her students to safety through a blinding blizzard. We can remember the cowboys who adapted their entire way of life when the old ways proved unsustainable. We can remember the communities that pulled together and helped each other through the worst winter anyone could imagine. These are our ancestors, biological or spiritual. Their experiences shaped the world we inherited. Their resilience and adaptability live on in us. When we face our own winters, we carry their strength with us. That's worth remembering as you drift off to sleep tonight, safe and warm, connected across time to those who survived when survival seemed impossible. Good night. Sleep well, and wake tomorrow grateful for the warmth, the food, the safety that millions of people across history could only dream of. But also wake knowing that you carry within you the same capacity they had to face whatever challenges come. You're stronger than you know. You're more resilient than you think. You're connected to a long line of survivors. That is the gift that the hard winter's story gives to us all. The cattle that died beneath the snow became the foundation for a more sustainable industry. The children who perished in the blizzard are remembered in monuments and stories that still teach caution and preparedness. The settlers who froze in their claim shanties demonstrated the limits of human hubris in the face of nature's power. All of these tragedies taught lessons that subsequent generations learned from. We stand now far removed from those desperate times, protected by technology and infrastructure our frontier ancestors couldn't imagine. But we face challenges they never knew, problems that will require the same qualities they demonstrated: courage, adaptability, mutual support, humility before forces greater than ourselves, and the determination to survive and rebuild no matter what. When you feel overwhelmed by modern challenges, when the problems of our time seem insurmountable, remember the frontier family that survived on beans and cornmeal for months. Remember the teacher who saved 13 children by leading them through a storm that killed hundreds of others. Remember the ranchers who lost everything and rebuilt on wiser foundations. If they could endure that, we can endure whatever comes our way. This has been the story of America's deadliest winter, the season that killed hundreds of people and hundreds of thousands of cattle, that ended an era and began a new one, that demonstrated both nature's power and human resilience. It's a story from long ago, but its lessons remain forever fresh. It's a story of death and loss, but ultimately of survival and adaptation. It's a story that deserves to be remembered and learned from. As the final words of this story fade into the night, as you sink deeper into sleep, let that knowledge comfort you. You are part of an unbroken chain of survivors stretching back through countless winters. You carry within you the strength of all who came before. You're more capable of facing hardship than you imagine. You are never truly alone, connected as you are to the vast community of humanity across time. Sleep now, let the story settle into your dreams, wake tomorrow renewed, grateful, aware of both your vulnerabilities and your strengths. The frontier is gone, but what it taught us remains. Winter came then. Winter will come again in various forms, but spring also comes. Life continues. We adapt. We survive. We grow. That is the human story, played out across time, always the same in its essentials, always different in its details. The story is ended. The winter is over. Spring has come. Sleep well. Surviving the Great Blizzard of 1887, America's Deadliest Winter continuation. The financial devastation wrought by the winter of 1886 to 1887 extended far beyond the immediate losses of cattle and property. The economic shockwaves spread outward from the frozen plains like ripples in a pond, touching industries and institutions that seemed far removed from the frontier catastrophe. Banks that had lent heavily to ranching operations faced a crisis of their own making. Throughout the early 1880s, financial institutions from New York to London had eagerly financed cattle ventures, viewing them as solid investments with reliable returns. The loans seemed secure because they were backed by tangible assets, the cattle themselves, which could be sold if borrowers defaulted. But when hundreds of thousands of cattle died, that collateral vanished overnight. Small frontier banks were hit hardest and fastest. These institutions, often serving a single town or region, had concentrated their lending in the local ranching industry. When their borrowers went bankrupt, the banks had no way to recover their losses. Some tried to seize whatever assets remained, land, buildings, remaining livestock, but found that these depreciated assets couldn't cover the debts. Within months of the spring thaw revealing the full extent of the die-up, frontier banks began to fail. The closure of a bank in a frontier town wasn't just an institutional failure, it was a community catastrophe. Depositors lost their savings. Merchants who had kept their business accounts at the bank found themselves unable to access their funds. The credit system that had lubricated local commerce seized up. In some cases, entire town economies collapsed when their bank failed, forcing residents to abandon communities they had worked years to build. Larger banks in major cities initially seemed insulated from the Western crisis. They had more diversified portfolios and deeper reserves. But as the scale of the catastrophe became clear, even these institutions felt the impact. Investment portfolios that included Western cattle bonds suddenly looked much riskier. The securities backed by those ranching operations became difficult or impossible to sell. Banks that had seemed solid discovered they were carrying significant amounts of what we would now call toxic assets. The insurance industry faced its own reckoning. Some cattle operations had purchased insurance against losses, though this was far from universal. Insurance companies that had written these policies, often based on mild winter data and optimistic projections, found themselves facing claims that far exceeded their reserves. Some insurance companies went bankrupt trying to pay claims. Others used legal technicalities to deny coverage, arguing that the extreme weather constituted an act of God not covered by their policies. This led to years of litigation and further soured investors on Western ventures. Stock prices for cattle companies that had been traded on exchanges plummeted. The Swan Land and Cattle Company, whose stock had been a darling of investors, saw its value essentially collapse to zero. Shareholders who had expected dividends found themselves holding worthless paper. The broader market for Western investments dried up almost immediately. New ventures that might have been easily financed before the die-up found it nearly impossible to raise capital afterward. The railroad industry, which had benefited enormously from the cattle boom, suddenly faced a very different landscape. Railroads had expanded into cattle country specifically to serve the livestock shipping business. They had built stockyards, loading facilities, and branch lines to reach remote ranching areas. When the volume of cattle shipments dropped by half or more, these investments looked much less wise. Some branch lines that had been marginally profitable became money losers almost overnight. Railroad companies responded by cutting back on services to affected areas, which further hampered recovery efforts. Trains ran less frequently. Maintenance was deferred. Some smaller lines were simply abandoned. This reduction in railroad service made it harder for the ranching operations that did survive to get their products to market, creating a vicious cycle that slowed recovery. The meatpacking industry in Chicago and other major centers saw its supply of cattle drop dramatically. Packing houses that had been running at capacity found themselves with excess capacity and insufficient supply. Workers were laid off. The price of beef rose for consumers as supply dropped, but this didn't help Western ranchers who had no cattle to sell. The entire supply chain from range to table was disrupted. Eastern and European investors who had poured money into Western cattle operations learned an expensive lesson about this difference between investment prospectuses and reality. Scottish investors, who had been particularly enthusiastic about American cattle ventures, lost millions of pounds sterling. English nobility who had dabbled in playing cowboy found their American adventures ending in bankruptcy. These investors didn't forget their losses, and their caution would affect Western development for decades. The overall economic impact on Western territories was severe and prolonged. Tax revenues dropped as property values declined and businesses failed. Territorial governments that had been anticipating robust growth based on expanding cattle industry suddenly faced budget crises. Some had borrowed money for infrastructure improvements, expecting future tax revenue to cover the debt. When that revenue didn't materialize, they struggled to meet their obligations. Employment in cattle country collapsed along with the industry itself. Cowboys who had been earning steady wages suddenly found themselves out of work. Support industries that had served the ranching sector, blacksmiths, saddle makers, feed suppliers, also saw their business evaporate. The multiplier effect of the cattle industry's collapse rippled through entire regional economies. Some communities simply ceased to exist. Towns that had sprung up to serve now defunct ranching operations were abandoned. Buildings that had been erected with such hope and effort became ghost structures, windows broken, roofs collapsing, slowly returning to the earth. The boomtown phenomenon that had characterized Western settlement went into reverse as people left areas that could no longer support them economically. Yet the economic transformation wasn't entirely negative. The collapse of the speculative cattle bubble cleared the way for more sustainable economic development. The concentration of land ownership in a few massive operations gave way to more distributed ownership patterns. Small and medium-sized ranchers who survived often found opportunities to acquire land at reasonable prices from failed large operations. Agricultural diversification accelerated as people recognized the danger of depending too heavily on a single industry. Farming operations that had been neglected in favor of cattle raising received new attention and investment. Regions began to develop more balanced economies that could better withstand shocks to any single sector. This diversification made Western economies more resilient over the long term. The financial institutions that survived did so by learning important lessons about risk assessment and management. Banks became more conservative in their lending, requiring larger down payments and more conservative projections. This made capital more expensive and harder to obtain, but it also led to more sustainable business models. The wild speculation that had characterized the early 1880s gave way to more sober and realistic business practices. Insurance companies that remained in the livestock insurance business after the die-up did so with much more sophisticated understanding of risk. They studied weather patterns more carefully, required better management practices from insureds, and priced their policies to reflect the real risks involved. This made insurance more expensive but also more reliable when needed. The railroad industry's adaptation to the changed landscape led to some positive developments. As cattle shipments declined, railroads sought other freight to carry. This encouraged agricultural diversification and helped develop alternative industries in affected regions. The railroads also learned to build and operate more efficiently, cutting costs and improving reliability in ways that benefited all users. Eastern capital didn't abandon the West entirely, but it became much more selective and careful. Investors demanded better information, more conservative projections, and stronger management before committing funds. This actually improved the quality of the Western ventures that did get funded. Projects with solid fundamentals could still attract investment, while purely speculative schemes found it much harder to raise money. The territorial governments that survived their fiscal crises emerged with more realistic budgets and more sustainable approaches to development. They learned not to base long-term commitments on the continuation of boom conditions. They developed more diverse tax bases and more conservative spending habits. These lessons served them well as they transitioned to statehood. The human cost of the economic disruption was significant but harder to quantify than the financial losses. Families that had invested their savings in ranching operations lost everything. Children who had expected to inherit prosperous operations instead inherited debt. Dreams of wealth and empire died along with the cattle. The psychological impact of such profound financial reversal affected people for the rest of their lives. Some of those who lost everything in the die-up demonstrated remarkable resilience. They started over, often in different occupations or different locations, applying lessons learned from their failures. Theodore Roosevelt, for instance, turned from ranching to politics and eventually became president. His Western experience, including the hard winter, shaped his conservation policies and his understanding of the relationship between humans and nature. Others never recovered from the financial and psychological blow. Men who had been confident and successful became broken and bitter. Some turned to alcohol or other destructive behaviors. Families were torn apart by the stress of financial ruin. Suicides weren't uncommon among those who saw no path forward from their losses. The economic catastrophe had deep human costs that extended far beyond mere dollars and cents. The legal aftermath of the die-up kept courts busy for years. Defaulted loans, disputed insurance claims, partnership dissolutions, and bankruptcy proceedings created a mountain of litigation. Lawyers found steady work untangling the financial wreckage, determining who owed what to whom, and trying to extract whatever value remained from failed operations. These legal proceedings sometimes took decades to fully resolve. The long-term economic legacy of the die-up was complex and multifaceted. In the immediate term, it was catastrophic, destroying wealth, ending businesses, and upending regional economies. But it also swept away unsustainable practices and unrealistic expectations, clearing the ground for more durable economic development. The West that emerged from the disaster was less glamorous than the West of open-range dreams, but it was also more stable and sustainable. Financial historians studying the period often point to the cattle die-up as an early example of how asset bubbles form and burst. The pattern of rising prices, increasing speculation, new investors rushing in, reality reasserting itself, and catastrophic collapse has repeated throughout financial history. The specific details change, but the underlying dynamics remain remarkably similar. Those who study the die-up can see echoes in subsequent financial crises, from the stock market crash of 1929 to the housing bubble of 2008. The die-up also demonstrated how quickly apparent prosperity can vanish when it's based on unsustainable practices and unrealistic assumptions. The cattle industry of the early 1880s appeared immensely profitable, but that profitability rested on favourable weather, adequate forage, and continued optimism. When conditions changed, the entire structure collapsed with shocking speed. This lesson about the fragility of prosperity remains relevant in our own era of rapid change and complex financial systems. Behind the statistics of death tolls and financial losses were individual human beings, each with their own story of survival, loss, heroism, or tragedy. These personal narratives bring the history to life in ways that broader analysis cannot. Let us spend time with some of these individuals, hearing their voices across the gulf of time, understanding their experiences as more than just data points in a historical catastrophe. Consider the story of Anna Johnson, a homesteader's wife in Dakota Territory. Anna was 26 years old in the winter of 1886, mother to 3 children aged 7, 5, and 2. Her husband Eric worked their claim while also hiring out for day labour to neighbouring ranches when money was tight, which it usually was. Their sod house was small but snug, built with Eric's own hands from prairie earth cut into blocks. When the early November snows came, Eric was away working at a ranch 20 miles distant. He had planned to return before any serious weather hit, but the storms came earlier and harder than anyone expected. Anna found herself alone with 3 young children, limited supplies, and no way to know when or if Eric would return. The situation that began as a temporary inconvenience stretched into weeks of uncertainty. Anna's days fell into a rhythm dictated by survival. She rose before dawn to rekindle the fire, carefully rationing the buffalo chips and twisted hay they used for fuel. She melted snow for water, a tedious process that yielded surprisingly little liquid from large amounts of snow. She prepared meals from their limited stores, stretching ingredients to make them last as long as possible. She kept the children occupied with stories, songs, and simple games to prevent the cabin fever that could drive people to despair or worse. The nights were hardest. After the children were asleep, Anna would sit by the dying fire and worry. Was Eric safe? Was he trying to reach them but unable to get through the storms? Had he been injured or killed? Would their supplies last until spring? What would she do if Eric never returned? These thoughts circled endlessly in her mind during the long, dark hours. Anna kept a diary during that winter, written in a mixture of English and her native Swedish. She recorded the daily routine, the weather, her worries, and small moments of grace. On December 10th she wrote, "Flour getting low, children always hungry, but I tell them there will be more soon. They believe me. I wish I believed me." On January 15th, no word from Eric. 23 days now. I try not to think the worst, but it is hard. Little Anna asks every day when Papa is coming home. I have no answer, but Anna also recorded moments of beauty and hope. On Christmas Day, made the children toys from scraps. Little Anna has a doll from an old sock. The boys have horses carved from firewood. They played all day, forgetting to be hungry. This is something. On February 3rd, sun came out today, first time in 2 weeks. So bright on the snow it hurt to look. Children went outside for 10 minutes, first time in days they could. Their laughter made me cry with joy. Eric finally returned in late February, having been trapped at the ranch where he worked by storms that made travel impossible. His return was both joyful and sobering. The family was reunited, but they faced the reality that they had nearly exhausted their supplies and had no money. Eric had worked through the winter but wouldn't be paid until the ranch could sell cattle in the spring, if there were any cattle left to sell. They would have to make it through another 6 weeks or more on almost nothing. They survived. Barely. By the time grass greened up in April, they were living on a diet of cornmeal mush and little else. The children had lost weight and were listless from malnutrition. Anna and Eric were gaunt and exhausted, but they were alive and together, which was more than many families could say. They stayed on their claim, eventually proved up, and raised their children to adulthood. Anna lived to be 87, dying in 1947. Among her most precious possessions when she died was the diary from that terrible winter, a testament to survival. Now consider Martin O'Reilly, a 22-year-old cowboy working for a large ranching operation in Montana. Martin had come west from Illinois seeking adventure and a chance to save money to start his own ranch someday. He was single, young, strong, and confident in his abilities. The hard winter would test all of those qualities and shatter some of his confidence. Martin was part of a crew of 8 cowboys responsible for checking on several thousand head of cattle scattered across a large range. When the January storms hit, he and 2 other cowboys were at a line shack 30 miles from ranch headquarters. The line shack was a crude one-room structure with a small stove, a few bunks, and minimal supplies. It was meant to serve as a temporary shelter for cowboys riding the range, not as a place to survive for weeks. The 3 men found themselves trapped by the blizzard. For 5 days, snow fell continuously and wind howled without cease. They could not venture outside except for the briefest moments to gather snow to melt for water. Their food supplies dwindled rapidly. Within a week, they were on half rations. Within 2 weeks, they were eating 1 meal a day of beans and whatever else they could stretch. The psychological strain of confinement was intense. 3 young men, accustomed to active outdoor work, found themselves trapped in a space perhaps 12 feet by 12 feet. They couldn't go outside. They had nothing to read. They had few topics of conversation that hadn't been exhausted. Tensions rose as hunger and boredom took their toll. Arguments broke out over trivial matters. At one point, Martin and another cowboy nearly came to blows over who had used more than their share of the firewood. What saved them was the leadership of the 3rd cowboy, an older man named James Old Jim Hawkins. Jim had worked on the frontier for 20 years and had seen hard winters before, though never one quite this severe. He maintained his calm and helped diffuse tensions between the younger men. He rationed their supplies carefully, making sure they didn't exhaust them too quickly. He led them in exercises to stay physically active despite the confinement. He told stories to pass the time and keep their minds occupied. When the weather finally broke enough for them to attempt the journey back to headquarters, they discovered that the landscape had been transformed. Familiar landmarks were buried or altered by massive snowdrifts. Navigation was difficult and dangerous. They travelled slowly, often having to detour around areas where snow was too deep for the horses. The 30-mile journey took them 3 days instead of the usual one. When they finally reached headquarters, they found the ranch in crisis. Of the original herd of 70,000 cattle, fewer than 20,000 had survived. The ranch was effectively bankrupt. The owner was preparing to liquidate the operation and return to Scotland. Martin and the other cowboys were informed that they would receive partial pay for their work and then the ranch would close. Martin took his partial pay and drifted south, looking for work in an industry that was collapsing. He found occasional jobs, but nothing steady. By summer, he had given up on ranching and taken a job as a freight wagon driver. His dreams of owning his own ranch were dead, killed by the same winter that killed the cattle. He eventually settled in Wyoming, married, raised a family and worked various jobs, but he never returned to cowboy work. The winter had shown him the reality behind the romantic myth, and he wanted no more of it. Or think of Sarah Chen, daughter of Chinese immigrants who ran a laundry and general store in a small Nebraska town. Sarah was 16 in 1888, helping her parents with the business while attending school when possible. She was in school on January 12th when the children's blizzard struck, one of 40 students caught by the sudden storm. The teacher, a young woman named Elizabeth Marsh, just 20 years old herself, faced the terrible decision of what to do. The schoolhouse was a simple frame building with a small stove. They had perhaps a half-day's worth of fuel on hand. Should they try to keep everyone at school overnight and hope the fuel lasted? Or should they dismiss school and hope everyone could make it home before the storm worsened? Miss Marsh decided to keep the students. She had heard accounts of the previous winter's storms and erred on the side of caution. It was a decision that saved lives, though it subjected everyone to a frightening night. As the storm raged and the fuel ran low, the temperature inside the schoolhouse dropped steadily. Miss Marsh had the older students, including Sarah, help gather anything that could be burned. School desks were broken up and fed to the fire. Books were sacrificed when the desks were gone. Even wooden pencils were burned to extract their small amount of heat. Sarah took charge of keeping the younger children calm and together. She gathered them in the center of the room, away from the walls where cold penetrated most. She led them in songs and games to keep their minds off the cold and fear. She shared her coat with 2 smaller children who were shivering uncontrollably. Her actions that night demonstrated a maturity and selflessness that belied her 16 years. As dawn broke and the storm finally abated, parents began arriving to collect their children. The reunion scenes were emotional, with mothers and fathers weeping with relief to find their children alive. Sarah's parents arrived mid-morning, having spent a terrified night not knowing if their daughter had survived. The embrace when they found her safe was one that Sarah remembered for the rest of her life. Sarah's experience in the blizzard affected her profoundly. She decided to become a teacher herself, wanting to help children the way Miss Marsh had helped her. But she faced significant obstacles. Anti-Chinese sentiment was strong in the West, and many communities would not hire a Chinese teacher. Sarah persevered, eventually finding a position in a community with a large Chinese population in California. She taught for 37 years, influencing hundreds of students and always remembering that night in the schoolhouse when Miss Marsh's courage and leadership saved 40 lives. These are just 3 stories among thousands. Each person who lived through that terrible winter had their own experiences, their own fears, their own moments of courage or despair. Some stories ended in tragedy. Families who froze together in their claim shanties, cowboys who died alone on the range, children who never made it home from school, ranchers who lost everything and took their own lives in despair, but many stories ended in survival, sometimes against improbable odds. Babies born during the blizzards who grew to adulthood, families who lost their homes but rebuilt and thrived, people who discovered strengths they didn't know they had, communities that pulled together and emerged stronger from the shared trauma. The individual stories remind us that history isn't just dates and statistics. It's lived human experience, with all the complexity, emotion, and meaning that entails. The numbers tell us that hundreds died, and hundreds of thousands of cattle perished. The stories tell us what that meant, how it felt, why it mattered. Both are necessary for true understanding. The question of how anyone survived the extreme conditions of the winter of 1886 to 1887 and the blizzards of 1888 is worth examining in detail. Modern understanding of human physiology, cold weather survival, and environmental medicine provides insight into what those frontier people faced and how they endured it. The human body's response to extreme cold is complex and potentially deadly. When exposed to very low temperatures, the body prioritizes maintaining core temperature at the expense of extremities. Blood vessels in the hands, feet, and face constrict, reducing blood flow to these areas to conserve heat for vital organs. This is why frostbite typically affects fingers, toes, ears, and nose first. Frostbite occurs when tissue actually freezes. Ice crystals form within and between cells, causing direct cellular damage. Blood vessels are damaged, leading to poor circulation even after rewarming. In severe cases, tissue dies and must be amputated to prevent gangrene. Frontier people who survived severe frostbite often lost fingers, toes, or other extremities. The crude medical care available on the frontier meant that even survivors faced serious risk of infection and further complications. Hypothermia is perhaps even more dangerous than frostbite. When core body temperature drops below 95 degrees Fahrenheit, body systems begin to malfunction. At first, the person shivers violently as the body tries to generate heat. They may feel confused or drowsy. As core temperature continues to drop, shivering stops, mental function deteriorates further, and eventually consciousness is lost. Death follows if rewarming doesn't occur. Frontier people developed various strategies for preventing and managing cold-related injuries, some based on sound principles and others less effective or even harmful. The practice of rubbing snow on frostbitten areas, common at the time, actually causes additional damage by furthering freezing the tissue and can cause ice crystals to physically abrade the frozen skin. The correct approach, warming slowly with lukewarm water, was known to some but not universally practiced. The shelters people lived in were critical to survival. Sod houses, common in treeless regions, actually provided excellent insulation when properly constructed. The thick earthen walls, often 2 to 3 feet thick, provided thermal mass that moderated temperature swings. A sod house was naturally cool in summer and easier to heat in winter than a frame structure with thin walls. The main disadvantages were poor lighting due to small windows, dampness, and the occasional falling of dirt or insects from the ceiling. Frame houses and log cabins varied widely in their effectiveness as shelter. Well-built structures with tight construction, good chinking and adequate insulation could be relatively comfortable. Poorly built structures with gaps and thin walls were desperately cold in extreme weather. Families often hung blankets or quilts on interior walls to add another layer of insulation. They might pile snow against the exterior walls to create an additional insulating barrier. The stove or fireplace was the heart of any frontier home during winter. Keeping a fire going continuously was essential. If the fire went out overnight and temperatures were extreme, the interior of the house could drop below freezing within hours. People sometimes slept in shifts to ensure the fire never went out completely. The risk of carbon monoxide poisoning from inadequate ventilation had to be balanced against the need to conserve heat. Some people died from carbon monoxide poisoning in tightly sealed homes, though this danger was not well understood at the time. Clothing was another crucial element of survival. The layering principle that we now know to be effective was practiced instinctively by many frontier people. Multiple layers of wool, which retains insulating properties even when wet, were common. Outer layers of canvas or leather provided wind protection. Improvised face masks of cloth or leather protected against wind and cold when people had to venture outside. Footwear was critically important and often inadequate. Many people simply didn't have boots warm enough for the extreme conditions. Some cowboys who had to work outside plunged their boots in water and let them freeze, creating a crude insulating layer of ice. Others wrapped their feet in multiple layers of cloth or even burlap sacks before putting on boots. The feet were particularly vulnerable to frostbite because they were in constant contact with cold ground and often got wet from snow. Nutrition played a crucial but not well understood role in survival. The body needs more calories in extreme cold to maintain body temperature. People who were already malnourished from food shortages during the winter had less capacity to generate body heat. The diet of many frontier families, heavy on starches like cornmeal and flour but light on proteins and fats, was not optimal for cold weather survival. Vitamin C deficiency, which causes scurvy, was a real risk during the long winters when fresh fruits and vegetables were unavailable. Symptoms include fatigue, weakness, joint pain, and eventually bleeding and death. Some frontier families maintained stores of preserved fruits or vegetables that provided minimal vitamin C. Others made tea from pine needles, which actually contained significant amounts of vitamin C, though this practice was more common among those who had learned it from indigenous peoples. The psychological aspects of survival were as important as the physical ones. Maintaining hope and purpose during months of confinement and hardship required mental resilience. Depression and despair could be as deadly as cold or hunger, because they sapped the will to keep fighting for survival. Families that maintained routines, continued education for children, engaged in productive work, and supported each other emotionally fared better than those who gave in to despair. Community connections, even when physical meetings were impossible, provided crucial psychological support. Knowing that neighbours were facing the same challenges, that you weren't alone in your suffering, helped people maintain perspective and hope. When spring came and communities gathered, the shared experience of having survived created bonds that lasted lifetimes. The contrast between how humans survived and how cattle failed to survive is instructive. Humans had shelter, fire, stored food, and the intelligence to manage resources carefully. Cattle had none of these. They faced the elements with only their body's natural defenses, which proved utterly inadequate for the extreme conditions. The lesson is clear. Survival in extreme environments requires not just toughness, but also intelligence, preparation, and adaptability. Modern survival experts studying the historical accounts of the hard winter and the blizzards have identified several factors that consistently correlated with survival. Adequate shelter that could be heated was paramount. Sufficient fuel and food stores were critical. Knowledge of cold weather hazards and how to protect against them made a significant difference. Psychological resilience and social support were essential. Physical health going into the crisis mattered. And finally, luck played a role that shouldn't be minimized. The survival rate among frontier people during these winters, while impossible to calculate precisely, was actually quite high considering the extreme conditions. Most people who had adequate shelter and supplies survived, though often with lasting effects. The deaths that occurred were concentrated among those caught outside in storms, those with inadequate shelter, those whose supplies ran out, and those who were already vulnerable due to age, illness, or injury. The cattle, by contrast, had a mortality rate that ranged from 30% to 90% depending on location and conditions. The difference between human and animal survival rates highlights the critical importance of intelligence and preparation in facing environmental extremes. Humans could plan, adapt, and help each other. Cattle could only endure until they couldn't. Medical knowledge of the time was limited but not non-existent. Frontier doctors and educated laypeople understood the basics of treating cold-related injuries, managing infectious diseases that might strike during confinement, and dealing with the various ailments that afflicted isolated communities. Home medical guides were common possessions, and people learned to treat common problems themselves out of necessity. Childbirth during the winter months was particularly risky. Women who went into labour during the worst weather often had to deliver without professional help, because midwives or doctors couldn't reach them. Many women and infants died in these circumstances. Those who survived often did so thanks to the assistance of female neighbours or relatives who had experience with childbirth. The traditional women's knowledge passed down through generations saved countless lives when professional medical help was unavailable. The human body's capacity to adapt to extreme conditions is remarkable. People who survived the full winter found that they had acclimated to some degree to the cold. What felt unbearably cold in November might feel merely uncomfortable by February. This adaptation was both physical and psychological. The body made physiological adjustments to cope with chronic cold exposure, and the mind adjusted expectations and tolerance thresholds. Yet this adaptation had limits. Prolonged exposure to extreme cold, inadequate nutrition, and chronic stress took cumulative tolls on health. Many survivors of the hard winter suffered lasting health effects. Respiratory problems were common, as were issues related to frostbite damage. The stress of the experience may have contributed to earlier mortality, though this is difficult to prove from historical records. The children who survived the winter sometimes showed remarkable resilience. The young body's capacity to recover from hardship often exceeded that of adults. Children who suffered malnutrition during the winter might catch up in growth once adequate nutrition resumed. Yet the psychological effects of having experienced such fear and hardship at a young age were lasting. Many survivors carried memories and trauma from that winter throughout their lives. In the end, the question of how they survived has no single answer. It was a combination of preparation, luck, intelligence, determination, mutual support, and the human body's remarkable capacity to endure hardship. Some survived through careful planning and wise choices. Others survived through sheer chance, being in the right place at the right time with the minimum necessary resources. All who survived demonstrated some degree of resilience and adaptability that allowed them to weather conditions that killed many others. The legacy of those survival lessons continued long after the immediate crisis passed. Subsequent generations growing up on the plains heard stories about the hard winter and learned from them. They understood the importance of adequate preparation, of community support, of respecting nature's power. These lessons shaped frontier culture for decades, and in some ways continue to influence the culture of Great Plains states to this day. One of the most haunting aspects of the children's blizzard is trying to imagine the experience from the perspective of the young victims and survivors. Children range from 6-year-olds in their first year of school to teenagers nearly ready to take on adult roles. Each age group faced different challenges and understood their situation differently. For the youngest children, those 6 to 8 years old, the blizzard must have been terrifying beyond description. These children had limited understanding of weather patterns or survival strategies. They depended entirely on adults or older siblings to keep them safe. When the storm hit and visibility dropped to zero, when the cold became painful and then numbing, when familiar surroundings became alien and threatening, these children faced pure terror. Imagine being 7 years old, walking home from school as you had done hundreds of times before. Then suddenly the sky darkens, wind begins to roar, and snow starts falling so thickly you can't see. Within minutes, you can't see your hand in front of your face. The cold is like nothing you've ever felt. You can't breathe without the air burning your lungs. You call out for help, but your voice is snatched away by the wind. You try to keep walking, but you're not sure which direction to go. You're frightened beyond measure, and there's no one to comfort you. Some of the youngest victims died calling for their parents. Search parties that found children's bodies days or weeks after the storm reported that some appeared to have been trying to dig into the snow for shelter, their small hands frozen in the act of clawing at drifts. Others were found huddled together, siblings who stayed together to the end. The physical evidence of their last moments was heartbreaking for those who found them. The survivors among the youngest children carried trauma that shaped their entire lives. Walter Meyer, who was 9 when he survived a journey home from school through the blizzard with his older brothers, later wrote about how the experience stayed with him. More than 50 years after the blizzard, being interviewed by WPA workers in the 1930s, he could still remember every detail of that terrible walk. The sound of the wind, the impossible cold, the disorientation, the pigs freezing and squealing in their pen as the children passed, the blessed relief of finally reaching home. Children in the middle years, roughly 8 to 12, faced their own unique challenges. Old enough to understand danger but not old enough to have adult capabilities, they often had to make decisions and take actions beyond their years. Some became heroes, protecting younger siblings or classmates. Others froze with fear or made panicked decisions that ended in tragedy. Consider 11-year-old Avis Dopp, whose teacher father kept his students at school overnight. Avis helped care for the younger children, keeping them calm and together through the frightening night. When finally reunited with her family, she had grown in ways that would have been impossible without the crisis. She went on to become a teacher herself, inspired by her father's actions and her own experience of the blizzard. Or think of the unnamed children who, separated from adult supervision when the storm hit, had to make life or death decisions on their own. Try to reach home, seek shelter in a haystack or snowbank, keep moving or stop and rest. With no experience to guide them and fear clouding their judgment, some made the right choices and survived. Others made understandable but fatal mistakes. The older children and teenagers, roughly 13 to 18, had the most complex experience. Old enough to understand fully the danger they faced, old enough to take on adult responsibilities, yet still children in many ways. Some demonstrated extraordinary courage and capability. Minnie Freeman, the 19-year-old teacher who saved her 13 students, was barely an adult herself. Yet she kept her head when panic would have been understandable, made wise decisions under extreme pressure, and successfully led her charges to safety. Other teenagers found themselves thrust into leadership roles when adults were absent or incapacitated. They had to care for younger siblings, manage household tasks, make decisions about resource allocation, all while dealing with their own fear and stress. Many rose to the challenge admirably. Some struggled or failed. All were changed by the experience. 15-year-old O.W. Meyer, whose account was preserved by the WPA Federal Writers Project, described dragging his younger brother through snow so deep the little boy couldn't walk through it. He and his older brother followed fence lines because they couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. They heard pigs squealing as they froze to death. O.W. was terrified but couldn't show it because his younger brothers were looking to him for reassurance. His account, recorded decades later, still conveys the fear and determination of that journey. The psychological impact on child survivors was significant and long-lasting. Some developed phobias related to winter weather. Others became hyper-vigilant about weather conditions, always watching the sky, always preparing for the worst. Many had nightmares about being lost in snow for years after the event. The trauma was real and deep, though frontier culture didn't really have frameworks for understanding or addressing childhood trauma. Yet many children also showed remarkable resilience. The human mind, especially the young mind, has a capacity to adapt and recover from even severe trauma. Children who survived went on to live full lives, raise families, and contribute to their communities. The blizzard was a defining moment in their lives, but it didn't necessarily define their entire existence. The stories children told about their experience often had a different quality than adult accounts. Children focused on different details: the color of the sky, the sound the wind made, specific moments of fear or relief, the faces of people who helped them. Adult accounts tended to be more focused on decisions made, distances traveled, and survival strategies employed. Both perspectives are valuable, and neither is more true than the other. Some children never spoke about their experience. The trauma was too deep or too painful to verbalize. They carried their memories silently, sometimes for decades. When the WPA interviews were conducted in the 1930s, some survivors spoke publicly about the blizzard for the first time in nearly 50 years. The emotional intensity of their accounts, despite the passage of so much time, testified to how deeply the experience had marked them. The children who lost siblings or parents in the blizzard faced particular challenges. Survivors' guilt, though not understood or named at the time, afflicted many. Why did I survive when my sister didn't? Could I have done something different to save my brother? These questions haunted some survivors for the rest of their lives. Without modern understanding of trauma and survivors' guilt, these feelings often went unaddressed and unresolved. Families that lost children in the blizzard sometimes struggled to resume normal life. Some parents became overprotective of surviving children, restricting their freedom out of fear of another tragedy. Others seemed emotionally withdrawn, unable to connect with surviving children in the same way after the trauma of loss. Children growing up in families affected by blizzard deaths sometimes felt they were living in the shadow of the siblings they'd never known or had lost. Schools in blizzard-affected areas sometimes held memorials or created remembrances of the children who died. These helped communities process collective grief and honor the memory of the victims. For surviving children, these memorials could be comforting, providing a sense that their lost classmates wouldn't be forgotten. But they could also be painful reminders of who was gone. The question of blame sometimes arose in complicated ways. If a teacher had dismissed school and children died trying to get home, were they responsible? If a teacher kept children at school but the building was inadequate and children froze, was that better or worse? There were no good answers to these questions, but they were asked nonetheless. Child survivors sometimes struggled with understanding whether adults had made the right choices. As survivors grew into adulthood, many became teachers themselves, motivated by their experience to want to protect other children. They remembered the teacher who saved them, or the teacher who made critical decisions under impossible circumstances. They wanted to honor that memory by serving children in their turn. This generational transmission of the experience extended the blizzard's impact far beyond the immediate survivors. The resilience demonstrated by child survivors was remarkable. Many went on to successful lives despite, or perhaps partly because of, the hardships they'd endured. They learned young that they could survive terrible things, that they had inner resources they hadn't known about. This knowledge, though purchased at terrible price, served them well in facing life's other challenges. The children of the blizzard, both those who died and those who survived, deserve to be remembered not just as statistics but as individuals. Each had hopes and dreams, fears and joys, unique personalities and potential. The blizzard took some of them before they had a chance to grow up and see what they might become. Those who survived carried forward not just their own lives but something of the memory of those who didn't make it. In telling their stories now, we honor both the dead and the survivors. As we near the end of this long journey through one of history's deadliest winters, it's worth considering what lessons from 1886 to 1888 might apply to our own time. The world has changed dramatically in the century and more since those tragic winters. Yet some fundamental truths about human vulnerability to extreme weather and the importance of preparation and adaptation remain constant. The climate science of the late 1880s was primitive by modern standards, yet the patterns observed then remain relevant today. The Plains region experiences significant variability in weather from year to year. A string of mild winters can create false confidence that persists until a severe winter shatters it. This pattern of variability hasn't changed, though our ability to predict and prepare for it has improved significantly. Modern climate science tells us that the Great Plains will continue to experience periodic extreme winters. Global climate change is affecting overall patterns, generally leading to warmer average temperatures, but this doesn't eliminate cold extremes. In fact, some research suggests that changes in atmospheric circulation patterns could make certain types of extreme cold events more common in some regions, even as average temperatures rise. The polar vortex, a circulation pattern in the stratosphere over the Arctic, has become familiar to Americans through several recent severe cold outbreaks. When this vortex becomes unstable and portions of it break away and move south, Arctic air can plunge far south of its usual range. This phenomenon isn't new. The hard winter of 1886 to 1887 almost certainly involved similar atmospheric dynamics, but our ability to forecast these events and prepare for them is vastly improved from what it was in the 1880s. Modern infrastructure and technology provide protections that frontier people couldn't imagine. Central heating means that if your furnace is working and you have fuel or electricity, your home stays warm regardless of outside temperatures. Modern insulation and construction standards create structures that resist heat loss far better than frontier buildings. The power grid, when functioning, provides reliable energy for heating, lighting, and communication. Yet this infrastructure also creates vulnerabilities. The Texas power crisis of February 2021 demonstrated that modern systems can fail catastrophically when faced with extreme weather they weren't designed to handle. When power went out during extreme cold, millions of people found themselves in homes that became dangerously cold very quickly. Modern building design, optimized for energy efficiency in normal conditions, sometimes performs poorly in extreme conditions when power is lost. The buildings are too tight to allow effective use of alternative heating sources like wood stoves, which is actually safer than the fire risk they present in modern tight construction. The food supply system has changed almost beyond recognition from frontier days. Most Americans have enough food in their homes to last maybe a few days or a week at most. We depend on complex supply chains that bring fresh food from all over the world to local stores. When those supply chains are disrupted by extreme weather, shortages can develop quickly. The Texas crisis again serves as an example. Stores were emptied within days as people panic-bought supplies. Medical care has advanced tremendously since the 1880s. Modern emergency medicine can save people with severe hypothermia or frostbite, who would certainly have died on the frontier. Antibiotics treat infections that were often fatal in the past. Emergency services can reach people in distress, at least when roads are passable. Yet extreme weather can overwhelm even modern medical systems, as hospitals lose power or become inaccessible to patients who need care. Communication technology provides advantages that frontier people desperately lacked. Weather forecasts, while not perfect, give advance warning of dangerous conditions. Emergency alerts reach people's phones instantly. News of developing situations spreads in real time. Yet this same technology creates dependencies. When cell towers lose power or become overwhelmed, communication can fail precisely when it's most needed. The social changes of the past century and more have been profound. Communities are often less tightly knit than frontier settlements were out of necessity. People may not know their neighbors well. The mutual aid networks that were essential for frontier survival have been partly replaced by government services and insurance systems. These changes have brought many benefits, but may have reduced resilience in the face of crises that overwhelm those formal systems. Economic systems have become vastly more complex and interconnected. This creates efficiency and abundance in normal times, but potential fragility during disruptions. The just-in-time inventory systems that minimize storage costs mean that there's less buffer stock available when supply chains fail. Financial systems are integrated globally, so disruptions anywhere can cascade everywhere. The lessons about economic vulnerability from the cattle die-up seem newly relevant in an age of complex financial instruments and tightly coupled systems. There's a tendency to think that technology and modernity have made us invulnerable to the kinds of disasters that struck frontier America. The experiences of recent years suggest otherwise. when Texas faced extreme cold in 2021, when the Northeast faced massive blizzards in 2010 and 2011, when California faced fire seasons that seemed apocalyptic, we were reminded that nature still has power over human systems. The fundamental lesson from 1886 to 1888 remains valid. Respect nature's power and prepare for extremes. This doesn't mean living in constant fear or rejecting modern comforts. It means maintaining appropriate preparedness. Supplies of food, water, and heat sources that don't depend on functioning infrastructure. It means understanding the hazards specific to your region. It means maintaining community connections that can provide support during crises. The frontier experience also suggests the importance of self-reliance balanced with community cooperation. Families that were completely self-sufficient and those that built strong mutual aid networks both had advantages. The best approach combined individual preparedness with community resilience. This balance seems as relevant now as it was then. Climate change adds a new dimension to these considerations. The patterns of extreme weather are shifting. Events that were once very rare may become more common. Regions that were relatively safe from certain hazards may become vulnerable. Adaptation will require both individual and collective responses. The stubbornness that led some frontier ranchers to refuse to change their practices, even as evidence mounted that those practices were unsustainable, finds echoes in modern resistance to adapting to changing climate realities. The indigenous knowledge that proved valuable on the frontier has modern equivalents. Traditional ecological knowledge from communities that have lived in specific regions for generations often contains important insights. Scientific knowledge, when properly communicated and applied, can provide crucial guidance for preparation and adaptation. Both ways of knowing have value. The failure of frontier settlers to heed indigenous warnings has modern parallels in the failure to heed scientific warnings about various emerging crises. The children of the 1880s who had to walk miles to school in dangerous weather might seem remote from modern children who ride buses or are driven by parents. Yet the fundamental parental concern remains the same. How do we keep children safe from dangers they may not fully understand? The trauma that affected child survivors of the blizzards reminds us that extreme events affect children profoundly, and that adequate support for traumatized children is essential. As you rest there listening to this account, the world outside your safe space may seem far removed from the frozen prairie of 1887 or the blizzard-struck plains of 1888. In many ways it is. Yet the fundamental realities of human vulnerability to extreme weather, the importance of preparation and adaptation, and the value of community resilience transcend time and place. We are not so different from those frontier people as we might like to think. We have more tools and more knowledge, but we face the same natural forces and have the same basic human needs. The hard winter and the blizzards taught lessons that remained relevant for generations. Those who learned and applied the lessons thrived. Those who didn't often failed. The same will be true for us and the generations that follow. The specific challenges differ, but the underlying principles of respecting nature, preparing wisely, building community resilience, and adapting when necessary remain as valid now as they were then. So as you drift towards sleep, secure in whatever warmth and safety surrounds you, perhaps spare a thought not just for those long ago people who suffered through America's deadliest winter, but for what their experience might teach us about facing our own challenges. The frontier is gone, but the need for resilience, preparation, adaptation, and community remains. We are their descendants, inheriting both their world and their wisdom. May we prove worthy of that inheritance. The story winds to its close now. The winter has ended. The blizzards have passed. Spring has come. The survivors have rebuilt. Life continues. The cycle turns as it always has and always will. And somewhere in the turning of that cycle, the lessons learned at such terrible cost remain available to those willing to learn them. That is perhaps the final gift that the hard winter offers us across the gulf of time. Not the suffering itself, but the wisdom purchased by that suffering.